Hi, Christopher.
Robert.
How are you?
A bit early to say.
Yeah, I agree. So you probably need no introduction, right? I mean, you're a columnist at Slate and Vanity Fair and author of God is Not Great, among other books. But is there anything else you want to say?
No,
about
that'll
yourself?
do it.
You think so?
Yeah.
So,
paperback of God is Not Great, available at fine bookstores everywhere.
I'm sorry, I left that part off. I don't know. Maybe because it wasn't my book. I forgot that part. So after many years, I finally made your acquaintance at La Ciudad de las Ideas in Puebla, Mexico, a few weeks ago. And I guess that's one factor that led to this happening. And I gather the idea, well, if I don't know who does, but I think the idea is that we're going to talk about foreign policy, and then we're going to have a second discussion about religion. Is that your understanding?
That was what I was told, sure.
And I guess there are some differences between my views on foreign policy and yours, which certainly came to my attention during the Iraq War, and maybe at some point we should talk about that. Is there anything you want to say by way of characterizing our differences or anything else?
The differences between us, which I'm pluralizing on purpose, I think became manifest specifically in what you wrote about Major Hassan's attack on his fellow soldiers at Fort Hood.
Right.
And in particular, you're saying that it should lead us to a greater understanding of religious rage. And I think we obviously can't assume, can we, that our audience already knows how we rehearse that. So shall I just say why I thought you were wrong?
Well, let me say what I think.
Well,
my
why don't
argument
you say
was.
what you thought first? Yes, that's better.
I think I was just making the point that given that everyone seems to agree that among the factors that drove him over the edge was his outrage over the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, however unstable he was to begin with, for whatever reasons of personal circumstance. That one thing to keep in mind about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars was that this is a potential cost of them to push people perhaps disposed to radical Islamism over the edge. And more broadly, I said that really this particular dynamic was consistent with what I think had been the kind of the left-wing view of the war on terror to begin with. At least it was the view that I espoused, which was that you shouldn't focus so much on killing the terrorists that you spread the terrorist meme, which I would say is what we did in this case. So that's kind of my argument.
Well, perhaps paradoxically, I'd want to start by agreeing with you. I mean, at least you didn't make any bones about the Islamist element in Major Hassan's actions. If you recall, there was at least a week where everyone was trying to find out any other explanation than that, including quite senior people in the armed forces. They said, okay, this terrible thing's happened. The first thing we must do is not find that it's related to his religion. The president seemed to imply that in what he said. It took about a week before it was very clear. Yes, he had shouted Allahu Akbar. Yes, he'd bought the weapon off base a long time before. Yes, he'd been in touch with Imam al-Awlaki, a very dangerous person wanted in connection with the 9/11 hijackers who were his friends. And yes, it turned out to be true that a few weeks before the atrocity at Fort Hood, Imam al-Awlaki had given a general theocratic permission on his website and in his broadcasts for attacks on American soldiers anywhere. So, I mean, I think the presumption of guilt is in respect of Major Hassan's fanaticism is pretty high. So, to that extent, we agree. Good. Now, let me put the case of Sergeant Papadopoulos, a soldier from Chicago of Greek-American ancestry. The island of Cyprus has been under Turkish military occupation now for a lot of years, ever since 1974. Partition, occupation, expulsion of Greeks. The United States has a very warm military relationship with Turkey. Are you telling me that if Sergeant Papadopoulos was suddenly to pack a clip into his gun and spray everyone around him on base, that this would be a wake-up call for our understanding that Greeks feel really very strongly indeed about Turkish imperialism? I don't think you'd do any such thing. There's a special privilege given to religious fanaticism in these cases, and I think it should be stopped.
I'm not sure I even literally heard everything.
I think religious fanaticism, in other words, makes it worse, not better. And the second thing is, if you're looking for how to diagnose Muslim outrage, once you start, you can't stop. I mean, what will it be this time? Will it be a cartoon in an obscure newspaper in Denmark? Leads to riots and killings and burnings and lynchings all around the world. Who would have known that was going to happen? A rumor printed in Newsweek about the defacement of a Quran at Guantanamo Bay leads to violence. The sight of women unveiled can lead to violence. The existence of homosexuals or Jews can lead to Muslim violence. If you want to take out an insurance policy and say, let's not do anything to upset these people, there won't be anything much you can do, not and remain as you are, at any rate, on the liberal left. Because everything that you care about the most, tolerance of sexual diversity, emancipation of women, protection of the Jewish people from genocidal threats, right of newspapers to publish cartoons and editorials, all of that's gone because you can't be too careful. This is no way to live, and I won't live like that for a minute.
Well, you don't have to worry about me living that way for a minute either. I mean, you've successfully carried my logic to an extreme that goes well beyond where I would have taken it. So we don't have to worry about...
Not an extreme. I think
we don't have to worry about me
logical...
saying you shouldn't stop genocide because it may offend someone. But if we could get back to where we started before this pretty epic extrapolation, do you agree with me that we can say that this is a cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in this one case, and not the only one actually on American soil, and may be something generically to worry about? Do you think it exemplifies a cost? I mean, I think you'd agree that before we launch wars, to the extent that we can, we should do a kind of a cost-benefit analysis, or maybe you disagree. But do you agree that we've just seen a cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, the 9/11 hijackers and the al-Qaeda cells were in the United States well before the United States was in Afghanistan or Iraq.
Right.
The Taliban had taken over Afghanistan, banned music,
right.
Banned women from appearing in public,
right.
Found new and even more cruel ways of executing homosexuals, right. And issued proclamations calling for the death of all Jews and all Hindus and all
right.
secularists long before the United States was.
Right. So we can exclude the hypothesis.
I flat out disagree with you. Islamic extremism, Islamic fascistic rhetoric and behavior is not created by the resistance to it. No. All the evidence we have is to the contrary.
Right. Not every instance of it is caused by that. Does that mean to you that not any instance of it could be caused by that? That would seem strange to me.
Well, I have no doubt that the latest Taliban attack on a girls' school in Afghanistan is motivated in their minds by the presence of American troops in the country, and certainly justified by them in public that way. But believe me, they'd be throwing acid in the faces of unveiled girls trying to go to school, whether we were there or not. So no. This is not produced by our resistance to it. Actually, the evidence is all to the contrary. In all the sermons of Osama bin Laden that were broadcast and that we have easy access to before the horrific attack on our civil society in September of 2001, all of those celebrate American weakness. They say, we will win because you notice how the United States has scuttled from Somalia. They're retreating all around the world. Their country is run by feminists and Jews and queers. Defeating them will be simple. Their rallying call was that America is weak, not that it's prepared to fight.
Christopher, I'm willing to concede that doing nothing ever militarily could have that downside. Okay, I'm just asking, are you willing to concede what seems to me obvious, that the Iraq War, which you championed, and the Afghanistan War, had at least this one downside? You're denying it? As I understand your argument, what you're saying is, wait, there was Islamist terrorism before the Iraq War, so it's impossible that any manifestation of Islamist terrorism could have been caused by the Iraq War. Is that your position?
The thing itself is not created by the Iraq War, is my position. Now, you're dealing with something I know you well enough to know, not just from meeting you, but from your writings, you recognize as a fallacy, which is that of post hoc propter hoc. I'd suppose it could be argued that the decision by al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia to blow up the most sacred shrine of the Shia people, the Golden Dome Mosque in Samarra, might not have occurred if there were no American forces in the country. That's possible, but I think it's unlikely because there are many countries where there are no American forces, such as Pakistan, for example, where the Al-Qaeda extremists blow up Sunni mosques as a matter of principle.
Wait, you think
the Hazara people of Afghanistan, the Shia population who were partly ethnically Persian, for example, were nearly destroyed under Taliban rule. In fact, at one point, Iran itself was considering invading Afghanistan to put a stop to that religious, clerical, ethnic atrocity until President Clinton stopped them from crossing the border. So, no, in no significant extent, to no significant extent, is this religious terrorism attributable to our decision to fight against it.
Well, if you think that mosque would have been blown up anyway, even if we had not invaded Iraq and Saddam Hussein had been allowed to maintain his iron grip on the country, I think it's safe to say you're in a minority, which I know is not a position you're afraid to be in.
No, I'm not. But I'm saying,
but, you know,
I actually said that I thought that particular one probably wouldn't have, but in general, the decision to declare the Shia to be heretics and put to the sword precedes our intervention there. Just as, for example, the decision of the Islamic insurgents in Algeria, where there were never any foreign troops, to announce that anyone who didn't agree with them was under the precept of takfir, excommunicated, liable to death, had nothing to do at all with the Western presence in the country. It was sui generis.
You know, you mentioned school opposition to the bill to letting girls go to school and things like that in Afghanistan is one thing that incites Islamism. The implication being that, of course, doesn't mean we shouldn't champion it just because it incites radical Islamism. There's a book called 3 Cups of Tea. Are you familiar with that? By this guy, Greg, it's Morrison or something, who...
Yes, I know of the book. I haven't read it.
Very courageously has gone around Afghanistan building schools either for girls or co-ed schools so that girls in Afghanistan can have an education. And if you read that book, and that book has actually been commended, I believe, to American troops, or at least soldiers who are studying counterinsurgency doctrine by I believe, General Petraeus. In any event, there's a good vignette in there of him showing a moderate Muslim who is explaining how much damage the Iraq War did, and the imagery generated by the Iraq War did to his own desire to foster moderation within Islam, and what a handy tool it is for terrorist recruiters. There's probably. It sounds like you're willing to acknowledge.
You're trying to apply, Robert. You're trying to apply reason and logic where it really doesn't work. A huge number of people have joined the jihad because they believe that the Israelis blew up the World Trade Center and that all the Jews left the World Trade Center just in time. I can't stop them from having that impression, but the impression they have comes not from any contact with reality or any reaction to objective circumstances, but from the belief in a fanatical religion. That's my first, last, and closing point on all of these things.
Well, but it's an assertion.
Now, if there wasn't a bomb that had fallen on an Afghan wedding, say, due to the incompetence of NATO and its refusal to commit ground troops, things of this kind, avoidable things, I'm sure the problem would be, to that slight extent, less. But in defining the problem, you're simply looking at the wrong diagnosis. You talk about Iraq. The Kurdish people of Iraq, as you know, as everyone knows, were subjected to poison gas, to chemical weaponry, to an explicit genocidal campaign, Quranically named, actually, by Saddam Hussein, the Anfal. It's a verse from the Quran about how you can plunder and destroy people. Deported, fill in mass graves. Nothing was spared them. When a bomb goes off in Iraq,
and in fact,
when a bomb goes off in Iraq
government...
or anywhere else, I know who it won't be. It will not be my Kurdish comrades who fought so hard for a free Iraq. They could claim justification for anything after what's been done to them. They don't do this kind of thing. And you discredit them when you say that, well, if you've suffered or if you think you're suffering or you've been insulted, you have the right to resort to violence, and if you do, it's our fault.
Christopher, this is such a fundamental misunderstanding of what I'm saying. And you're
I wish it was.
What you're saying, if I could talk for just a little while, what you're saying is that when I point to a downside of something we've done, I point to a cost incurred by American action, including a crime that I'm saying was ultimately resulted from American action, in this case the murder of people at Fort Hood. What you're saying is that I'm justifying that murder, and I'm assigning blame to America. And
you
I'm
say,
emphatically,
I think
I'm
you
not
just
only,
said,
Christopher, I'm not only emphatically not doing that, I've repeatedly said I'm not doing that. And what you're doing is a favorite talking point on the right, which is whenever anyone points to an unfortunate consequence of American policy and suggests that maybe we should revise our thinking about that policy in light of the consequence, they say, oh, you're blaming America, you're blaming America. No, we're not, but saying we're blaming America is a very effective way, given human psychology, to shut off debate, intelligent debate entirely, which is what the American right wants, and which is the only effect of what you're doing.
When our viewers replay what you just said, I think they will hear you say that the murder by a man who'd sworn a Hippocratic oath of his unarmed colleagues at Fort Hood was a consequence of American action. I believe that's what you said. I think it would not have happened had we not launched those two wars. Well,
that's
then,
correct.
all I wanted to do was to get you to say that. I'm content now. I think you've definitely made your point.
I think there are all kinds of crimes that are committed that would not have committed but for some circumstance. That doesn't mean it's a legally or morally mitigating circumstance. It just means
I'm sure you
it's
wouldn't
a
want to say
fact
that.
about the way causality works in the physical universe, that things are that complex. And
You
to the
think
extent that you can
regard
take
this-
that into account in your thinking about policy, I
You
think
re-
you
you
should.
regard this
You think
to-
we shouldn't.
You regard this to you as a physical law? Like
No, I didn't say it was a physical law.
you seem to imply it a second ago.
Well, all laws are I'm a materialist. All laws are grounded in the workings of the physical world. Yes, all causal laws. Yes.
I too am a materialist, but
Good.
I also, and I'm very preoccupied for that reason with the question of whether or not we have free will. But there's certainly many people, individuals and nations, who've been very badly maltreated, who do not resort to sadistic violence and claim that God ordered them to undertake it.
There certainly are, and there are people who smoke cigarettes and don't get lung cancer. Does that mean that cigarettes are not a contributing factor to lung cancer, and that they, in certain isolated cases, are what push the person over the edge into lung cancer? You're saying that's not the case?
Again, I'm very happy just to have you say that. I couldn't make my point better.
No, I think you made the opposite of your point. You're saying that if I can show someone who was exposed to the type of circumstance that in one case caused X, and it doesn't in this case you point to cause X, then it can't be a contributing factor and can in no case cause X. That's what you're saying, and I'm saying no. The fact that cigarettes sometimes don't cause lung cancer doesn't mean that they don't in any individual.
Good.
Is that all? I win?
No. I just want everyone to hear you say all that.
Okay. Good. And they can replay it as often as they like. Now, do you want to talk about the Iraq War broadly?
Sure.
So, because I do think it's kind of, it delimits our worldviews pretty effectively. But first of all, you don't agree with me, I gather, that in terms of international law, the Iraq War was a pretty dubious enterprise.
Well, international law itself in some areas is rather dubious, but there have been vague, nebulous. There are four conditions, it's generally thought, under which a state, a government, can lose its sovereignty. One is if it invades and occupies the territories of neighboring states. The other is if it commits genocide. That's if you're a signatory to the Genocide Convention, which we are. The third is violations of at least the spirit of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In other words, fooling around with illegal acquisition of nuclear weapons. And the fourth is giving aid and comfort and hospitality to nihilistic international gangster groups. Now, Iraq was guilty of all four of those things on more than one occasion. It was a serial offender under all four. Hadn't been punished for them at the time it was doing them, but had put itself way outside the law. And after the attempt to annex Kuwait, to destroy a neighboring country, not just to occupy and invade it, but to abolish its existence, a member state of the UN and of the Arab League, signed a ceasefire with the United States, on condition of which its regime was allowed to retain power. Many of us thought at the time that was a mistake. It continued to violate all the terms of that ceasefire. It seems to me that it would have been much better to have put an end to the Saddam Hussein regime in 1991. It would have spared the Iraqi people some terrible years of suffering and misery. And it would have shown that the United Nations was serious about disciplining members that don't have any respect for international law. But if you believe that the only violations of international law or the only important ones are committed by those who considered Saddam Hussein to be an outlaw, I certainly know where you're coming from. I'm familiar with that viewpoint.
Well, so wait, you're saying there's these four things that legitimize invasion,
Yes.
or at least strip a nation of its immunity to invasion.
Yes.
One of them is having invaded another country?
Yes.
You're talking about Kuwait?
Kuwait and Iran.
Well, okay, but I mean, Kuwait, of course the Iran
And
war...
I suppose one might add the launching of indiscriminate missile attacks on the state of Israel, which was a non-combatant in the Kuwait war.
During
I
the
can
Kuwait
go on
war.
if you like about that.
Okay, but of course the Kuwait war, I mean, that was the most recent infraction we're talking about. The Kuwait war had been literally dealt with under international law. The Security Council got together, rolled back the aggression, dropped a lot of bombs, killed a lot of Iraqi soldiers. It could have, if it wanted to, inflicted more punishment, but the body in charge of enforcing that bit of international law chose not to. And,
yeah.
on
certain conditions that Iraq signed at the ceasefire agreement on the border,
right.
all of which it later broke. I say Iraq. I mean, I don't mean to say Iraq. I mean the Saddam Hussein crime family, which considered itself to be, and in fact was, the owner of everybody and all property within Iran.
First of all, that's a separate matter from the invasion per se, which just had been dealt with. So I don't think that particular leg of your argument holds up. Now, you're right. Subsequently, as a result of the invasion, Iraq agreed to do some things with respect to its nuclear weapons, and you say that another justification is fooling around with weapons of mass destruction, another justification for invasion. That strikes me as the most ridiculous of the four, because, of course, Iraq had let the inspectors in, and they were not denied access to a single facility that they asked to inspect, and there's no doubt that if George Bush had been earnest about wanting to find out if there were indeed ongoing infractions, he could have gotten, for the rest of eternity pretty much, to continue searching for weapons in exchange for holding off the invasion. So the idea that we had to invade to find out that they didn't have nuclear weapons is ridiculous.
The question of the great thesaurus of United Nations resolutions that was accumulated by diplomacy over the years was this: would Iraq come into compliance with the resolutions that confirmed its disarmament? Now, you're not going to tell me that you think Iraq ever came into compliance. A bizarre thing observed by many people inside and outside Iraq was the apparent unwillingness of Saddam Hussein to admit he didn't have weapons, even if he didn't. He wanted people to think that he did. He wanted to keep everybody permanently on tenterhooks. They never came into compliance. That's why the United Nations Security Council voted unanimously before the business of the second resolution was brought up by Mr. Blair, to say that they weren't in compliance and serious consequences would naturally follow. I myself would have thought that was authority enough. I wish the second resolution debate had not been allowed to muddy the waters.
You didn't take his admitting the inspectors and letting them go wherever they wanted as a way of saying, I don't have nuclear weapons?
He did not let them go wherever they wanted. He wouldn't allow, for example,
He absolutely did.
No.
And I encourage people to fact check this and come up with a single facility, Christopher. Come up with a single facility. I don't expect you to have it at your fingertips now, but I would like somebody to point to a facility to which the inspectors were denied
you're barking
access.
up the wrong tree there. For example, the inspectors were not allowed to take Iraqi scientists out of the country to interview them.
That is true.
They weren't allowed to use the U-2 overflights. There was in existence a Ministry of Concealment, an actual office of the Iraqi state run by one of Saddam Hussein's sons, designed for the bamboozlement of inspectors. Rolf Ekias, who I know very well, who was the head of the UN inspectorate in the first round and whose reappointment was blocked by France and Russia for reasons that are too obvious to go into, told me he was offered a direct bribe by Tariq Aziz, the foreign minister of Saddam Hussein, to try and alter his reports. If they asked Rolf Ekias, it means they would try to bribe everybody. We have no reason to think that it didn't work, at least some of the time, as the Oil for Food program was being used to corrupt the United Nations process as well. And we know from the memoirs of Dr. Mahdi Obeidi, Saddam Hussein's chief nuclear scientist, that he himself was ordered to bury a centrifuge in his garden and did. And we have the open record. We have the open record of that being dug up and shown on camera. That was all for anyone to see. They tried to bury what they had against the day when the sanctions would break down and Saddam Hussein would be out of his famous box. The presumption of guilt in the case of Saddam Hussein and double dealing on WMD is absolute.
Well then, but the accusation was that he had nuclear weapons and an active nuclear program.
No, actually, it wasn't that he had nuclear weapons. It was that he had
an active nuclear program,
or had a plan to reacquire and maintain the expertise to
right. And it's not
chemical and biological weapons.
And
yes.
if you have the free run of the country and can go anywhere you want, it's not hard to establish whether that is or is not the case.
How many inspectors were there?
You know, if you know as well as I do.
How big is Iraq?
You know as well as I do that if George Bush had been earnest and had not just been looking for an excuse to invade and had said at the last minute, I will hold off on invasion if we multiply by 10 the number of inspectors and give them another 2 years, you know damn well the Security Council would have done it in a minute. And in any event, if he didn't think they would, he could have tried. But he didn't try because he didn't want to avoid the war. Now, it's fine to point to technical senses in which Saddam Hussein was still in non-compliance. But if what you're saying is there was some kind of serious effort to find out whether he had nuclear weapons, and in the end, invasion was the only option, that is utter nonsense, and I think you would have to agree to that.
The President's speech to the United Nations on September 11th, 2002, mentions that as only one of 4 major objections to the continuing private ownership of Iraq by this psychopathic crime family. But I think it's good enough because, as an argument, yes, because that regime was the only one that we knew had both acquired and concealed the acquisition of and the manufacture of, and then later used on neighbors and on its own population, weapons of mass destruction. Now, that's a very grave state of affairs. It wasn't punished at the time; it should have been, but it's been punished now. And I find I'm not sorry that Saddam Hussein is no longer the private owner of Iraq with his terrible his terrible son.
Oh, I'm not sorry about that part. There are just other questions. That's definitely an upside. I mean, I think perhaps more than you, I will concede the upside of policies I oppose. Most policies have some upsides, but right now, I mean, to focus on that right there, you're talking about Anfal, which people argue about whether it comports with the definition of genocide in the strictest sense. But leave that aside. The fascinating thing about that is, as you know, the American government was a supporter of Saddam Hussein's when he conducted that campaign. In its aftermath,
absolutely,
and with considerable knowledge of the fact that he had conducted it,
yes,
the American government, if anything, redoubled its support of Saddam Hussein, and in fact shared with him.
I'm painfully well aware of that.
Yeah,
trying to draw attention
to it. So it's a little bit ironic.
That seems to be absolutely to undermine your main point. The more that's true, the more we incur the responsibility to put right what we did wrong before.
Oh, I see. So we can abet a horrible crime, and then we are the policeman who punishes the other guy that we abetted without punishing ourselves. This leads to a larger point, the absurdity that I just highlighted, Christopher.
If you find you've been complicit in a terrible crime against humanity, which the Anfal crime was, and you seem to argue a moment ago that it doesn't fit the definition of genocide. It certainly fits the definition. It certainly fits the definition that says that there is a plan to exterminate, in whole or in part, the national existence of a people. If you find you've been under a previous regime, another incarnation, as a nation responsible for that, I would say it doubles your responsibility to cancel that obligation.
See,
wouldn't you want to agree?
This leads to another point. The idea of America having been an accomplice to this crime, then getting in high dudgeon about the crime and invading him on the basis of it. The irony of that underscores a larger point hovering over this whole discussion of international law.
Not sure I see the irony there.
What? You don't see the irony?
Irony is a word that's very
I
precious
think
to me.
irony, at a minimum, it qualifies as. Whether it's, maybe we could have an argument as to whether it's a paradox that should cripple the policy you advocate, but I don't think anyone would deny irony, Christopher.
Well, if only irony was just paradox. No, it's actually something that's rather literal rather than ironic. You have, by being not just a bystander, which would have been bad enough, but as you correctly point out, an accomplice in a terrible crime against humanity, it seems to me you definitely take upon yourself the responsibility to redeem that horrific complicity and neutrality. And I'm very glad to say that instead of filling mass graves in Iraq, the United States is now helping the Iraqi and Kurdish people to dig them up and to put on trial those who murdered them.
This brings us to a larger point, the idea of the United States taking on that responsibility.
No, not taking on. No, excuse me, that's exactly the opposite word. Not taking on. Accepting, realizing, saying, yes, it's true. We can't wash our hands of this.
Okay, in any event, I mean, there's a larger question hovering over our discussion of international law here. There's the question of whether you delineated these crimes that you say qualifies under international law. I actually think there's a problem probably with each of them, including the question of why we didn't punish him at the time. And I would say in the case of his undeniably abetting terrorism, well, if we invaded every country that abets terrorism, first of all, we'd be invading some allies. We'd be invading Pakistan now, not to get the Taliban, to get the government. Okay, because they have, I think you'd agree, Pakistan has abetted terrorism. That seems to me not a policy we're consistently enforcing.
So, yes,
and indeed,
in the name of God,
we might, on reflection, invade ourselves, given the fact that we have supported things like extra-legal death squads, which, if they're morally distinct in an important way from terrorism, it's a distinction that eludes me. Okay, but again, hovering above all of
well,
this.
then what you've just said would be a very convenient way of making all moral action impossible.
Well, it would.
You're making
make,
the best the enemy of the good, and then you're denying the possibility of doing even a bit of good.
No, I've actually got a way to get around that, which leads to the point I've been trying to get at. Hovering above all of this discussion of international law is the separate question of who is authorized to enforce it. If I go in and break down my neighbor's door and I say, look, there are illegal drugs in here, and there indeed are, that does not mean I've acted lawfully, right?
No,
now,
I wouldn't say so.
Now, some of us who are very serious about constructing a system of international law that will really merit the term, which admittedly we may not have here, would like, whenever possible, to actually exercise the legitimate mechanisms of enforcement of international law. In this case, the Security Council, okay, not the United States. If we let every country, if you said it was legitimate for every country in the world to go around invading anyone that they deemed guilty of any of the four things that you just outlined, the world would be chaos, okay, if that freedom were actually exercised. Some of us would rather rely on a body of international law like the Security Council, which, of course, has often been paralyzed and inactive, and ironically, in this case, had been unprecedentedly effective in getting the inspectors into Iraq to determine whether Iraq was or was not guilty of the primary allegation against it.
And have found it refusing to comply.
And I really regret, and I think one of the costs of the Iraq War was that we let that potentially valuable precedent not only wither, but it kind of backfired. It made nations, if anything, less inclined to comply with the dictates of the Security Council. If after all you're going to get invaded, whether you do or whether you comply with the fundamental spirit of it or not. Right. So
it's hard to know quite at which point to.
There's one point. The U.S. is not judge, jury, and executioner, Christopher. That's the point. It's just a simple point.
So you say that the self-evident flouting of all the laws governing non-proliferation by the current regime in Iran is not opposed by Russia or China just because they think the Americans made a mistake in Iraq. The Russians and Chinese would otherwise be in full compliance at the Security Council and saying, yes, it's true, the Iranians have broken all the rules, we have to do something about it.
No, I don't believe that. Why did you think I did?
I'm so glad to hear you don't. So take another case, Rwanda, where the United States actually vetoed the proposal to double the strength of the UN force preemptively because they knew that the genocide was in preparation. Everybody knows now how terrible our abstinence and our neutrality were. They weren't even neutral. In the end, it was abstention on behalf of the génocideur, of the Hutu mass murderers. Now, suppose it had been the other way. The UN says, right, we should send a vast mission of aid and defense to Rwanda and do it swiftly so as to prevent the near extermination of half its people. Which member state do you think would have got the job of actually producing the planes, the troops, the massive drops of food and medicine and so on? You know very well it wouldn't have been Belgium, it wouldn't have been China, it wouldn't have been Russia either. The United States is not just the host country and one of the founder countries of the United Nations, it's the one without which it doesn't work. And, for example,
right,
if your advice had been followed, Slobodan Milosevic would still be he might actually have died by now of natural causes, but he would have spent some time being the president of a greater Serbia that included a destroyed Bosnia, a massacred Bosnia, and a cleansed Kosovo. The United States, in my opinion, quite rightly decided to save, by the way, I'll add this, the Muslim populations of the Balkans, the Kosovar and Bosnian ones, on a NATO initiative, and said that since the United Nations is never going to do anything about this, that doesn't mean we have to watch the recrudescence of National Socialism in Europe. I thought that was a great thing, and I think it should be added to what we'd said earlier, that why doesn't Major Hassan say, well, you have to give it to the United States. If it wasn't for them, all the Muslims of Balkan Europe would have been killed. No one ever says that. No action is attributable to a US action like that. It's only attributable to the US when it's the other way around, supposedly. We actually saved Kuwait, a Muslim country, from destruction. We saved Afghanistan from beggary and slavery. We saved Iraq from a terrible fascist dictator and the Iraqi people, the Shia majority of whom are very grateful to us, and the Kurdish ones too. None of this is ever counted in, is it? When the question of terrorism and irrational theocratic violence has been discussed. You're kind of changing
you're covering a lot of things here. Let's say.
Well, I'm trying to make it consistent with our earlier discussion.
Yeah. You said that if I had my way, we would not have intervened in Bosnia. I can point you to columns I wrote long before the American government finally decided to support intervention there, advocating intervention.
What about the UN? What if the UN is against, as it was?
Actually, I don't think the UN, in the end, I think that did get UN support, did it not? It was, in any event...
It doesn't matter, because it certainly wasn't done with the United Nations' permission.
I think it had, in any event, what I argued at the time was that this was actually a clear-cut violation on a couple of grounds, okay? It was, first, there was transborder aggression, because the boundaries within the former Yugoslavia had already been recognized when that was taking place. So Serbia was it was transborder aggression, as I said, it was. Yes. And unlike the case you bring up with Saddam Hussein, it wasn't something that had happened 10 years ago and already been punished, as with the Kuwait invasion. It was happening now. The ethnic cleansing / genocide was happening now, okay? So it's not at all comparable to what you're talking about in Iraq.
I was only saying, sorry, I was addressing myself to your view. I was addressing myself to your view, derived, I'm not quite sure from where, that the only lawful authority for the use of force in international relations is the Security Council of the United Nations. I don't think that is a very easy view to hold, if you're as consistent as I doubt you are, about things like human rights and genocide.
I would not say that if there is a clear-cut, for example, ongoing genocide, you should be paralyzed by the Security Council's failure to act. I concede that the bodies of international law have not yet evolved to a point where we can rely on them wholly.
Well, how are you thinking about Iran now, for example? I mean, what more proof do you need that the Iranian regime is outside the law, both at home and abroad. The United Nations, do you expect the United Nations to take up this responsibility? I'd ask you a straight question.
This is another case where, first of all...
do you or don't you expect them to take it up?
What's that?
Do you expect the United Nations to become seized of the matter, that Iran is in absolutely open, contemptuous defiance of all the treaties it's ever signed, all the undertakings it's ever made, to the European Union, to the International Atomic Energy Authority, to the NPT, and to the UN itself? Do you suppose that now the United Nations, faced with this undeniable state of affairs, is going to help to disarm Iran? Do you or don't you?
Iran raises two questions. If you ask me what I would like the Security Council to do...
No, I didn't ask you that.
What are you asking me?
Since I did ask you a direct question, why pick the one I didn't ask?
Okay, what did you ask?
Do you expect the United Nations to live up to its evident responsibilities in this respect?
Actually, I think it's not so clear here what the evident responsibilities are. There's it's really, I think, experts tell me it's not so clear that we would have to stop anything Iran is evidently doing to keep it in compliance with a non-proliferation treaty. What we would have to do, and this I would support, and this is something we have not offered Iran, by the way, in the terms I'm about to describe. We have not said to Iran, if you let inspectors go wherever they want, more or less, in keeping with the so-called additional protocol to the NPT, you can enrich nuclear materials for verifiably peaceful purposes. As long as we can monitor and these inspectors can go not only to declared sites, but wherever they want, we will let you enrich. That's a deal we have not offered them in those terms. We have said things like, if you let inspectors in, then as confidence grows, and we'll be the ones who determine when confidence has grown, then we may let you enrich and so on. This is a deal that I think would keep Iran within the bounds of the NPT, but it is more likely to accept than anything we've offered. So if you've asked me what I'd like to see, I'd like to see that. Now,
I'd like to see that too, I really would.
Well, there's a large, and it's one of these things where, why not at least make the offer? Okay, maybe they turn it down. Why not at least make the offer? And yet it's not even official American policy.
Sure, why not? Sure, why not? It helps them run out the clock. It helps them think that this is too easy. It confirms them in their existing long record of contempt and bad behavior. Why not? It's certainly consistent with everything we've done so far.
Okay, so then, so you're against it, I take it.
No, I'm for trying it too, just to convince the last doubter. Why not? Why not? But I don't think we have an infinity of time before we have a theocracy that's at war with its own people and threatening its neighbours that will be able to say to us, what do you propose to do about us now that we have thermonuclear capacity?
Well, by the way, speaking of the people that it's at war with, I know one of the criteria by which you make a lot of foreign policy decisions is you're supportive of the forces of democracy. So am I, all other things being equal. There is this irony in Iran, which is that the so-called good guys, the forces of democracy, seem more obstinate, even than Ahmadinejad, in this particular case. According to the Kremlinologists, if they're to be trusted, Ahmadinejad was in favor of the deal whereby their nuclear materials would have been transported to Russia, and the opposition, and maybe what the critical mass was in the opposition, came from, among other places, from the reformers. But I don't want to get in the way of your...
there are nationalists among the reformers, that's true.
Right.
There's no question about it. But the consistent finding that all measurements, some of them are obviously limited and crude, of measurements of opinion in Iran, where I've been myself and made some inquiries, the very consistent finding is that a majority of Iranians want the restoration of full diplomatic relations with the United States and friendship with America. Now, they have to know that the price of that is not that they give up their nuclear program, but that they give up a nuclear weapons program. We'll build them the reactors. We've said we'd like them to have nuclear capacity because it's so much better than squandering their oil. And such reactors as they do have were mostly built, in any case, by the United States. They can have all that and a lifting of the embargo as well, and a lot of prosperity and free exchange. That's what they want. I don't think it's true the Iranian people, given that offer, if they were allowed to vote in their own name and create a government that was in their own image, would say, no, we care so much about the weaponry that we don't want any of that. All the evidence is to the contrary. It's very important, I think, that we become, I say we, not just the United States, people like you and I, become firmer and faster friends of the Iranian democratic movement and ask ourselves every day, what have we done to help them?
Well, I'm certainly not against their taking over, but there is just one larger issue that I think frames the Iran case, and that is just, you ask what should the Security Council do? Well, one problematic thing, and I'm sure this seems especially problematic from the point of view of some Iranians, is just a massive inconsistency. The fact that we have let the idea of a consistent non-proliferation regime just completely fall apart. I mean, for example, if Iran tomorrow said, in keeping with the terms of the NPT, we're getting out of the NPT, we're opting out, which you're allowed to do under the NPT, and we're going to build nuclear weapons, then they would have exactly the same standing as Israel, Pakistan, and India. And yet I don't think you would really fundamentally change your view of what we should do about Iran. And granted, the Iranian regime, of all those four regimes, the current Iranian regime is the one I would least like to have nuclear weapons in the hands of. But the larger point is, we're not able to say to the Iranian people, here is this general principle that we expect you to abide by, that we would expect any nation to abide by. And until we are able to do that...
That's not quite true, because what Iran is doing is building a weapons capacity while remaining a signatory of the NPT.
We don't know that per se, Christopher.
Yes, we
do not know if they have violated the NPT in a technical sense, I think. At least there are people who know more about it than I do that argue that.
Well, I congratulate them on their lenience and
Me too.
Broad-mindedness. The fact is that if it was up to me, the Pakistanis, for example, would never have been able to acquire nuclear weapons by piracy and secret dealing and theft as they did, let alone to share those fissile materials with Libya, North Korea, and others through the nuclear Walmart that we allowed them to run under the regime of AQ Khan. But I might just add here on the point of non-proliferation, the AQ Khan network would never have been uncovered if Colonel Gaddafi had not turned over all his fissile materials to the United States, or potentially fissile ones, and his arsenal, and he wouldn't have done that if it hadn't been for the deposition of Saddam Hussein. So actually the contribution of the intervention in Iraq to non-proliferation globally and in general has been greatly underestimated.
Oh, I beg to differ.
But because it's not my fault or yours that the states of Pakistan and Israel and others have unlawfully acquired nuclear weapons. But we are faced now with a very aggressive state that's at war with its own people and threatens its neighbors, that uses messianic rhetoric, becoming a thermonuclear power. Now, I just don't like the idea of you wanting to change the subject there. That's true, whatever else is
I told you what I would do about it, and I told you why...
You didn't say what you'd do about it. Oh, what, you'd make them a better offer on inspections?
The deal I would offer Iran, yes.
Okay.
And look, if it were my world, you said in your world Pakistan wouldn't have acquired nuclear weapons. Well, okay, fine, but from the Iranians' point of view, the question is,
if we're
why
allowed
aren't
to
you
do all
threatening
that,
to...
I mean, I admit, if we're allowed to do all that, I mean, if it was up to me, there would be no such place as Pakistan. India would never have been partitioned. The great post-colonial crime of the British Empire, the greatest probably of all, was that.
And if it were up to me, there would be various larger initiatives being looked at with regard to Iran, which are not politically feasible.
Me too.
But you know, your point about Iraq contributing to non-proliferation because it may be that it's what led Libya to fess up about its nuclear weapons.
There's no
let me just take issue with you there. Even if I grant you that not hypothetical, but the unknown, what exactly caused Gaddafi to make up his mind on that, it could well be the war, granted. It equally could well be the case, as I speculated at the time, that once North Korea saw that even if you let inspectors in, you get invaded anyway, that significantly reduced the chances that they would play ball with the international community. And, of course, they've since demonstrably developed nuclear weapons. Okay, and that is to me as plausible a consequence of the Iraq War as the one you posited. But B, more broadly, as I said, what the United Nations had accomplished, and thanks to George Bush, I would add, it was only under the threat of the troops he was amassing that Saddam Hussein let the UN inspectors in. But the fact is,
what you'd never say.
That was a vital precedent that could have done great things to nurture the ongoing evolution of a non-proliferation regime. Instead, the opposite happened. This evolution was sabotaged by George Bush. And I still say, on balance, the Iraq War was very bad for the non-proliferation cause.
Well, I spoke to the British diplomat who had been the ambassador in Tripoli. He was then, when I met him, he was in Iran at the time, who said that Gaddafi was induced to give up. And remember, he gave up his weapons and he offered his surrender of them, not to Chirac, not to Putin, not to Kofi Annan, not to the European Union. He went first to Blair and then to Bush. Suggestive in itself. We got him in three ways. One, we had very good intelligence, better than we had in Iraq, I'll freely concede. We shocked him when we went to him and said how much we knew. Third, the Lockerbie business. Second, the Lockerbie business was becoming totally oppressive to him. The Scottish courts were never going to let up. And three, he was terrified by what he'd seen happen to Saddam Hussein. And when he handed over his material, it was more than we thought he had, and more advanced as well. It's all in Oak Ridge, Tennessee now, a good place for it to be. But by analysing it, said, where the hell did he get this? We walked back the cat. It can only have come from Pakistan. And we shut down, much too late, the AQ Khan network. I think that's a generally positive thing. Robert, to go back to what you were saying before about North Korea, I'm sorry to say, I keep finding this note of what I'll call masochism in your argument. Whenever anyone behaves badly, it's because they think we've been mean to them, or we've been cruel to them, we've been nasty to them.
That's not what I said about North Korea.
You did. You said they said the lesson the North Korea drew was if we let in inspectors and gave them free access, it would do us no good. Don't you understand that the whole North Korean state is based upon the idea that there will have to be an ultimate war with American imperialism? That there's nothing we can do to make them behave any better. That they're absolutely committed to this course of folly. They've starved their own people till they're 6 inches shorter than a South Korean to make this happen. The idea that if we were more warming and gentle to them, that they would be less aggressive, is ridiculous and I think very dangerous, as well as I have to say somewhat humiliating. I don't consider my hatred of and suspicion of the North Korean regime to be the contributing cause to the revolting way in which it treats its neighbours and its people.
No,
you have to learn to call these things by their right names. I
didn't say that our treatment of North Korea is what had contributed to its behavior. I had said it's at least possible. And my view of the intrinsic and eternal obstinance of the regime is not quite as severe as yours. I grant that it's kind of a tough case. But what I said was that their assessment of the carrots and sticks that we were laying out and continued to lay out was colored by what they had seen in Iraq when Iraq came into essential compliance with the fundamentals of what we ask in terms of letting in inspectors. And we invaded and deposed their ruler and ultimately killed him anyway. That's not a way to encourage people to let inspectors into their country. I think you'd agree. But, as long as we're on the subject of upsides and downsides of the Iraq War...
That's why they fire a missile right across Japan. Without warning, the Japanese find one day a missile's been launched, flies over their country and lands on the sea on the other side. Of course that's going to happen because the United States invaded Iraq.
No, I don't think that. No. You'll be happy to hear I don't see a causal relationship there. So we agree on that. But as long as we're on the subject of the costs and benefits of the Iraq War, but there's one, we're running out of time. There's one I'd like to ask about in particular. I think everyone agrees that the situation in Pakistan, where you have a radical insurgency and you have nuclear weapons, is massively more dangerous than anything that we now know we actually faced in Iraq. Pretty much everyone agrees that the focus on the Iraq War distracted us from the whole Afghanistan-Pakistan region in a way that exacerbated that situation. I would think that alone comes close to being a damning indictment of the Iraq War. You obviously must disagree because you still think the Iraq War was a good idea. So do you not concede any connection between those two?
I've always thought that's a totally bogus argument, if you don't mind my using that word, because Iraq was in our future no matter what. We can't say, because of Afghanistan, we cancel Iraq. With this huge country on the Gulf that's at a choke point of the world economy, exactly between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Sorry, to the Iraqis and to everyone else. We can't pay attention to that now. We're all tied up in Afghanistan. That would be not just to cease to be a superpower, it would be to cease to be a thinking country at all. Iraq, unfortunately, forced itself upon us, and I think that, in a very, admittedly, very clumsy and incompetent way, we finally lived up to long inherited responsibility.
I don't see how Iraq
I also think you're
itself.
wrong at the other end of your syllogism, in that everything we needed to know about the danger from Pakistan and in Pakistan was available to us and should never have, attention I should, for no reason at all, under no pressure, have wavered. I wrote an article which you can look up easily. It's in a collection of mine called Love, Poverty and War. Long report from Pakistan, just after 9/11, long before any real confrontation with Iraq was in the offing, saying exactly why this is a terrifyingly dangerous place. There was no one. If you are exculpating any American official who didn't do their job in pointing to that danger, if you say to them, allow them the exit clause. Oh well, we were all so busy with Iraq we couldn't be bothered. No, we had a long-term, very heavy commitment in Pakistan, and we played it wrong, and we still are playing it wrong. It's not because of Iraq that we fail to see that Pakistan still wants Afghanistan as its colony, and that it invented the Taliban in order to have a dependency, a client state in Afghanistan. And it did that long before 9/11. And that it wants to do this because it wants strategic depth for a war with India over Kashmir, and that it is India, the only other multi-ethnic, multicultural, secular, democratic superpower in the world of that scale, that we should be making an alliance. Our whole policy now is dead wrong, the AFPAC keyhole through which we look at these things, because it ignores the two potential superpowers in the region, India and Iran. Getting those two things right are what's important.
Okay,
Iraq makes no difference to this argument at all.
Let me do two things. Running out of time. Well, first, I'll just, for the record, say I don't accept your contention that Iraq was foisting itself upon us as a major security problem and was bound to remain one. I just think, we actually, in fact, no one was even claiming that Iraq had an actual nuclear weapon or a true biological weapon in the sense of a biological weapon that is contagious and for which we lack a vaccine.
No, I don't mean the weapons threat, Robert. I'm sorry. I mean the fact that Iraq was a country falling to pieces on the Gulf. It was because of the sanctions, which were necessitated by its refusal to come into compliance. And because of the fascistic nature of the regime, we were looking at another country like Congo or Rwanda turning into a black hole on the Gulf, a terrible, maimed, wrecked, traumatized place, as indeed has partially happened in spite of the intervention.
Well, yesterday, 5 bombs blew up in Baghdad and killed over 100 people, so I wouldn't say, looking at that and the previous 6 years, we entirely avoided chaos in Iraq. But
well, I know the last people, I already know the last people who are going to blame for those bombs are the people who rigged them and set them off. There must be a better explanation than that, according to you.
It's not a question of blame. The people who set those bombs are culpable.
I would say,
it's a fact of the matter that had we not invaded Iraq, those 5 bombs would not have been set off. And we're closing this with the distinction I was trying to drive home at the beginning, the distinction between a clear causal analysis and the question of blame. If you cannot divorce yourself, if you cannot divorce those two things, if you continue to conflate them, as right-wing propagandists love to do, you will never be able to get clear on the consequences of foreign policy. I'm curious to ask you, do you think the bombs in the Madrid train station and in the London subway system are also a result of the invasion of Iran? I don't know enough. I suspect that they might not have happened, but I don't know. But in any event, the people who set them are culpable for those bombs. Let me say, okay, so anyway, as I said, I wanted to do 2 things in closing. One is just assert that, for the record, I don't buy that part of your premise. The other is, let me close by A, giving you the last word, and B, perhaps self-servingly, giving it to you in a realm where I'm not positive I disagree with you anyway. It's this question of Afghanistan and Pakistan. I feel so unsure on what the smart thing to do is in that realm, and you sound like you have some ideas. So, in closing, I would let you, first of all, just A, say whatever you want to say, and I promise not to reply about anything you said, but B, I would like to hear what your recommendation is about what we do in Afghanistan and Pakistan now.
Well, it's very generous of you, but I mean, I don't feel I need a free kick, as it were. I think that the two things that are wrong with the President's speech are, first, the sense of history, and second, the sense of geography. This is actually a historic engagement that we have with that region, and it's part of being the United States. There's no sense in which we can disengage or withdraw from. It's puerile to think so, and we have to think in terms of decades and centuries. And he thinks in terms of electoral cycles, and that was pathetically obvious and made him do the self-evidently silly thing of, roughly speaking, saying how we will strengthen our hand by announcing when we'll fold it. They've been playing catch-up on that trivial point ever since. This is going to go on for the rest of my life and my children's lives, this confrontation. Second, it's wrong geopolitically. The narrow, little tiny telescope with which we look at it, the so-called AFPAC, is a provincial and parochial perspective. The critical thing is to get right our relationship with the great secular multicultural democracy, India, which is the regional superpower. Currently, we seem to be saying we take the Pakistani side in that quarrel. We don't, explicitly said by General McChrystal, we don't want India interfering in Afghanistan, where it's been a big help in providing aid and money and materials to the Afghan people, as it was to the Northern Alliance who were fighting the Taliban before we were. And second, if we don't get Iran right, if we don't find a way of putting ourselves simultaneously, and again it's history and geopolitics, for the first time in our history, on the democratic side in Iran, on the side of the people, and against their oppressors who are trying to guarantee themselves against regime change, as Saddam Hussein did by the illegal acquisition of nuclear weapons. So we don't get that right as well. We are done for in this area. So what I would like is a president who had some sense of history, had some sense of geopolitics, and also some sense of the right side to be on. Actually, it's quite possible to get all those three things in alignment. I think it's impossible to have a policy that doesn't, by the way. Any policy that doesn't do all three is doomed. It's not even stopgap. We're rewarding the Pakistani regime that invented and still sponsors the Taliban. We're paying, we put it like this, we pretend to pay them to stop doing it, and they pretend to stop doing it while taking the money. This is A, humiliating, short-term and limited, and three, doomed to fail.
Okay, well, as I said, I'll let you have the last word.
Well, you would be, I mean, I almost wondered how much more generous you'd be. Thank you anyway.
I enjoyed this. I always enjoy, your writing is inevitably thought-provoking, Christopher.
Thank you.
And it provokes a number of reactions from me, and men, I would say thought is among them. And I thank you for coming on. Hi, Christopher.
Robert.
This is the second of two dialogues that we're taping consecutively, which will explain why some of our clothing may seem familiar, or at least in my case, to people. And I think I plan to use this fact defensively. Should my mind seem to weaken, it's 2 consecutive hours of discussion/debate with Christopher Hitchens is something that no one should have to do. It's strenuous, but
thank you. I think
we persist. What'd you say?
I said thank you. I think.
Yes. No, I meant that in a nice way. We'll get to the stuff that I don't mean in a nice way shortly. In fact, let's start with one. The one thing. Okay, we're going to talk about religion now, and one thing I've always wanted to ask you is about the subtitle of your well-known book, God is Not Great, which is, I think it's either How or Why Religion Poisons Everything. Yes. Probably How, right? And I've often wondered how literally you mean that. I mean, you don't mean I shouldn't drink this glass of water because everything has been poisoned by religion, right? You're not taking it quite that far.
No, but I do say that it does, so to speak, poison the whole well, in that it attacks us in our deepest integrity. The main point I encounter in debates with the faithful is the claim that without the supernatural guidance, we wouldn't ourselves be able to determine right and wrong or distinguish between the two. That we're playthings of a dictated morality. And I find that objectionable for so many reasons, but the one I'll isolate for this purpose is that it appears to rob us of our responsibility as well as our integrity. And so, yes, that actually would, once that attack's been made, it will creep into absolutely everything, and I think does.
Mm-hmm. I guess I don't think it's as easy as some people do to, and this is not a defense of faith by itself. It's just a point. I don't find it as easy as it is commonly asserted by, in particular, Dan Dennett, for someone without reference to religious assumptions to construct a morality and indeed to sustain a belief in absolute right and wrong. Now, I myself am faced with that challenge because I don't subscribe to any conventional religious faith or claim any kind of revealed faith that would guide me here. So I'm familiar with the problem of trying to construct on a secular foundation a moral philosophy to live by. I actually think, and I think most philosophers who study what is it called, meta-ethics, I guess, the ultimate foundations of ethics. I think most of them would agree it's a quite contentious question as to whether it is doable. I mean, where do your moral? I mean, you tell me. You, I think, believe in right and wrong in some fairly absolute sense. You tell me if you don't believe in God, where do you get these beliefs?
Well, I don't know where I get them from, but I know there were things that I was, so to speak, born knowing and didn't need to have, excuse me, instilled in me or inculcated. And I think that the origin of them is what's made our civilization possible, which is that as a species, once we left the savannah, it was necessary to have, well, and indeed I'm sure on the savannah as well, to have a certain degree of solidarity, reciprocity, mutual aid. It might sound reductionist to say that it's evolutionarily advantageous to have this. Other species have it too, as we've observed. They have families, they have solidarity in the face of enemies, they care for their children, and so forth. They're young, let's say. It's not peculiar to us, but we have a special awareness of it, and we seem to have a revulsion to the same sorts of things. In other words, to keep it at the primitive level for now, I mean, incest and cannibalism, say, hardly need to be forbidden by any religious code. Some religious codes actually almost mandate them, but they don't last for very long because people who practice incest or cannibalism won't make it. Those societies will collapse, or those tribes will collapse. Now, some people would want to say, I suppose, this sounds a bit cold or a bit mechanistic. I mean, what of altruism and so forth? Well, I can't tell you either why it is that I get pleasure from making a blood donation. But I do. I enjoy doing it. I feel I've done a good thing. Makes my day. In addition to that, I haven't lost a pint of blood, or only for a few minutes. I regain it with a strong cup of tea. But someone else has gained one. And I happen also to have a very rare blood group, so I have a general interest in the blood donor system continuing to function. I don't think there's any need to involve a supernatural being in this, and if there is, then you have to explain why that supernatural being so often wants you to do immoral things. And he'll tell you, you must destroy not just the Amalekites militarily and the Midianites, but you must kill all their children and enslave for prostitution their women
and the livestock. If
yes, I mean, these things are, or you must mutilate the genitals of your children, something that wouldn't naturally occur to me to do. You'll suddenly present you with a baby girl or a baby boy. You think, here's the first thing I've got to do to prove I'm in line with divine morality. I must find a sharp stone and hack around at their genitalia, which appears to suggest, by the way, that the argument from design is also nonsense, because you're born into the world with stuff that God thinks is superfluous, having gone to all that trouble to make you in his image. This is nonsense, and it's also, I think, wicked nonsense.
Yeah, he could have saved himself some trouble by just
could. So
just redesigning the order.
What's obvious to me is, therefore, supernatural morality is not, in fact, supernatural. It's the projection of the man-made onto other human beings.
Yeah, I certainly don't deny that. I still think it's not so easy to construct an airtight absolute morality from purely secular premises. Again, I'm in a position where I have to try myself. It just doesn't seem that easy. I mean, you said that there are things that for whatever reason feel good. Well, I think the knowledge that we're designed by natural selection should lead us all to cast some suspicion on all the things that naturally feel good. I mean, there's reason to believe that rape under certain circumstances, and certainly killing under certain circumstances, that most of us would not applaud, is natural, and that the impulse to do it is natural. That doesn't mean we should obey the impulse, right?
No, when I say it makes me feel good, of course, I don't just mean it gives me a bang, because there are things that I've enjoyed doing that I've also felt bad about doing. I don't think I necessarily want to specify, but I'm sure anyone...
Feel free.
I'm sure all the customers know roughly what one's talking about, the various kinds of opportunism. But it's a strange thing. One definition of morality, as you know, is what you do when nobody's looking. Conscience is one word for it. That's the one that C.S. Lewis preferred. Adam Smith called it your unseen auditor. You feel that you don't want to be looked at askance by someone you don't actually know, but you can imagine taking a bit of a dim view of what you're doing. There are various attempts at it, but it does seem to be, except for the proportion of socio and psychopathic people in the population, who either get positive pleasure from unkindness to others, or who don't realize that other people are also important. These presumably also are made in God's image, and or are, I would prefer to say, the product of natural selection. But for ordinary discourse, I think it's enough to say that children indeed can be seen to have some innate sense of fairness, of what's cruel, of what's nasty, even though it may need some reinforcement.
Yeah, but of course we're using cruel and nasty as if the definitions were self-evident, and the whole problem of metaethics is to come up with a premise about what is good to begin with, and then build on that. Well, now, I myself am a utilitarian because I think it's just about self-evident that human happiness, human welfare is a good thing.
Yes.
But I think if you don't posit something like that, I don't know where you go. And I kind of doubt, although I don't know that you would call yourself a utilitarian. So I don't know where you get your premises.
I find utilitarianism a bit thin, but I'm perfectly willing to have as common ground that the obligations of society, the human solidarity, as I prefer to call it, are, if you discharge them, if you live up to them, feel obliged by them, they're good for others and good for you. And it hardly needs to be pointed out that you have an interest in the welfare of other people. For example, I want other people to have good health because I don't want infectious disease in the school my children go to. I want everyone to be vaccinated, all this kind of thing. I mean, it's very ABC. The difference is, it seems to me, between that and religion is this. Religion can order good people to do bad things. That's the surprising thing. We'll say you are to consider your homosexual friend less than human. You are to consider women to be an inferior creation. Every monotheism says that at one point or another, sometimes very emphatically. These are not helpful to our evolution at all. In fact, they're gravely retarded. You are to mutilate the genitals of your children, for example. You are to regard infidels as people who should be enslaved or killed. It's the wickedness that's preached by religion that intrigues me. It's so often assumed that, the Ten Commandments are at least okay. Well, look, there's no society ever been known where perjury and theft and murder are highly prized. And there were many, many human societies long before the mythical events that are supposed to have occurred in Sinai. We don't need God to tell us that. It takes the same God of Moses to order and license and give a warrant for slavery, rape, genocide, and mutilation.
Right. I know. I don't think we do need God to tell us in a fundamental sense to be good. I think that there are various intuitions that you and I would both endorse that are natural, and indeed there are ethical premises that people everywhere happen upon, regardless of how divergent their religion. So it's hard to attribute that to certainly to any one religion. But I think maybe where we differ is the question of whether religion is necessary to do bad. You're right that religion can order people to murder. Well, so can nationalism. So can anything that is given moral force by people who subscribe to it. And everyone attribute moral force to something, pretty much to something they subscribe to. And when they kill people, they justify it in those terms.
Of course.
What's not clear to me
people do have a tendency to decide that violence is justified in their own case. But if you want a multiplier for racism and nationalism too, if you say that this nation or race has God on its side, I mean, as you know, the belt buckles of every soldier in the German army that organized Hitler's genocidal imperialism, the belt buckle reads "Gott mit uns" in German. Yeah. God is with us. It's a huge multiplier of what might already be latent in possessive, acquisitive human beings. I think you'll find that's consistent across the board.
Of course, most American soldiers were probably believers, and their courage during the war, that very same war, was probably sustained by the belief that they would go to heaven, and I think you would say they were on the right side. So it seems to me that in that case, it's certainly far from being the case that religion was on balance. No, I mean, and of course the Americans won.
That's true, but it would support my point that this is man-made, because it can't possibly be that God was on both sides.
Well, certainly man-made, Christopher. You're not going to get. I'm not. You're not going to get an argument with me about that stuff.
No, I'm not trying to pick one. I'm just saying it's
I want to get back to the subtitle of your book, How Religion Poisons Everything. It's just not evident to me that it does. So what do you say?
I think that religion makes good people consider doing or justify doing bad things. And I'd add that it often makes very intelligent people say very stupid things.
And it also often makes people do very good things. What do you say about someone like Martin Luther King, who I think we both say did very good things, who presumably was sustained and fortified by his religious faith? Is that not an example of religious belief doing good?
Without knowing the man, I can't be sure of that. I know two things. One, I would propose one thing and I would say I knew another. I think it's highly unlikely that he would have been indifferent to the civil rights of black Americans if he wasn't a Christian. After all, most of the people who organized and started the civil rights movement were secularists. They've all been written out of the record now, but the people who actually organized the March on Washington, people like Bayard Rustin, famous social democrat, people like A. Randolph, the great black trade union leader, right. Walter Reuther of the United Automobile Workers, none of these people were godly in the least. That's the first thing. I don't know. Of course, you don't have to believe in God to believe that African Americans have rights. Second,
right.
It is tactically certainly true that in the conditions of the South at that point, you had a better chance of getting your voice heard and broadcast, and also a certain immunity if you were doing it from the pulpit, because it's the most Christian part of the country, and also because the justification for slavery in the first place and later for segregation was biblical. So it was a way of tactically turning the tables, but that only replaces the question, doesn't it? I mean, it was Christianity that brought this horrific state of affairs about. Third, I'd add, by preaching the Exodus myth, that was his template, always going on about promised land, etc. We're fortunate that Dr. King didn't seem to believe what he said, because the Exodus myth entitles the oppressed and wandering people to kill anyone who gets in their way and take their land, rape their women, enslave their children. Fortunately, he wasn't a believer in the Testament.
Well, that fact points to what I've noticed again and again, which is the exquisite adaptability of religion and the ability of people to selectively resort to Scripture to do either good or bad. In this case, it seems to me good. I would say, in the case of the fact that Christianity brought us slavery and the fact that there were secular people on Martin Luther King's side, of course, there were also very religious abolitionists. Again, yeah. It seems to me about 50-50 on balance. In any event, the idea that religion poisons everything is a long way from
not 50-50, no.
Can I just ask you, are you saying Martin Luther King was not religious and cynically used the pulpit? Did I hear you saying that?
No, I wasn't him, and I didn't know him, so I don't know whether he was a sincere believing Christian or not. I mean, he studied Hegel and Marx when he was in college. He had a lot of friends. Most of his friends seem to have been secular leftists.
Well,
I don't know if he was himself. What he thought when he was alone, whether he really prayed and really believed prayers were answered. I have no idea what he if he'd confined himself to praying, he certainly would have got nowhere.
Well, I haven't heard you.
I have to say you're wrong about 50-50 with abolitionism. Centuries of Christian-endorsed slavery, and then a few decades where a minority of Christians finally decide that this is intolerable. But the people who founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, for example, Benjamin Franklin was a member, Thomas Paine was a member. These were not believers. The chances that you'd be a non-believer and an abolitionist would be much, much, much higher than that you'd be a Christian. And to this day, where slavery is officially practiced anywhere in the world, it's always with the authority of a religious text. Well, that's actually not, except in North Korea, which I would define as a slave state, which is a worshipful pagan state, worships human beings. Generally, most slavery in Africa now is justified by the Quran.
I mean, I would say two things about Martin Luther King. One is, yes, there were various secular people involved in the civil rights movement. Again, I don't think religion particularly disposes you toward good. I'm not making that argument. I'm making the argument that it often does good, and so that the subtitle of your book, unless it's meant as hyperbole or as a joke, is overstated. And I would say in the case of King, true, there were many secular people, but he, more than anyone, showed, more than anyone I can think of, showed the kind of courage that is almost uniquely evinced by believing that there's a good chance you'll be assassinated pretty soon if you keep speaking in public, and yet speaking in public. And that's the kind of thing that a Christian can do because they think they're going to heaven. Now, secondly, I would say, you entertain these doubts as to whether he's really religious, and of course that's convenient for your analysis since he clearly did good.
No, I can't know it.
Christopher, if I can just finish, I have not heard you entertain those kinds of doubts about radical imams, who I would say are at least as likely to be cynically using religion, but that's not a theme I've heard you emphasize.
Oh, well, then you should have done. I mean, when you hear radical imams saying to people, if you put on this belt and blow yourself up and kill the Jews, the sons of pigs and monkeys, you'll go straight to paradise. It's actually occurred in the minds of some people who've given up suicide bombing. If you're so sure of that, why don't you do it yourself, Imam? Why don't you? Of course, I think that au fond, at bottom, all religion is partly hypocritical and partly racketeering. I just don't say that it all is. Now, just back to King for a second. I don't know that he was a true believer. I can't know that. He was able to give sermons that would stir even someone like myself. I can say that much. What you said about him, though, and his willingness to die for his beliefs could just as well be said, and was often said, of heroic communists, including in the South, by the way. The American Communist Party's most shining record is in the civil rights movement. What does that say to you about American communism? It says nothing to me. I suppose it stands to their credit that they did do that, but it proves exactly nothing about the doctrine of communism, or their heroes in the Spanish Civil War, or the resistance to Hitler, and so forth. I mean, you could easily say it, but it would be trivial.
I'm not saying religion is a prerequisite for good or courage or anything else. You're the one with the subtitle, Why Religion or How Religion Poisons Everything.
Yeah, and I've explained why I think that's so. I think it's an attack on our integrity. It says that we are the playthings of the supernatural.
Well, right.
That we excuse our own responsibility, and we wouldn't even know right from wrong if it wasn't for divine ordination, revelation. I think that makes us contemptible. It makes you a slave right there. And if you're a slave, then all the pleasures of art, which religion has contributed to, music, which it's contributed to, so all of these things are transient because you're by definition an unfree person. So I believe that the crucial emancipation that every individual and every society ultimately has to make is from religion. There. I'll say it all again if you like.
Well, no, you don't have to. In a way, the reason I dwelt in the beginning of this dialogue on how it is that a secular person goes about constructing an ethical system was to establish my belief that basically pretty much everyone gets by in life on the basis of some beliefs that they actually can't prove, okay? And in that sense, it's not strictly rational. And in that sense, religion is not uniquely irrational in helping people provide themselves with a foundation for ethics. Now, forgive me, but in the various things you said in response to my questions, I did not hear any kind of coherent argument about why you should trust certain moral intuitions or why X is good or Y is good. And I'm really not sure you've done the work to permit yourself to say that whereas religious people have to accept something on faith or something they can't prove, you get by in life without anything of that sort. It's not clear to me that that's the case. So if what you're saying with that subtitle is that religion uniquely keeps us from having an entirely rational foundation for our lives, I beg to differ. I think almost no one has an entirely rational foundation for their life. I fear to say that maybe one of the people who has the best case for having one would be someone like Nietzsche. I mean, I think it's certainly internally consistent to say that nothing is morally self-evident to you, and in that sense rational.
Right. Well, first, I don't disagree with you about the partly rational, because we're members of a primate species that's the product of evolution by mutation and natural selection, and our prefrontal lobes are not quite as big as they might be, and our adrenaline glands are probably larger than we now need, and we are only partially rational, and it certainly shows. We're only half a chromosome away from being chimpanzees, but we, I think, have ways of revering and preserving our rational faculties. And if you asked me who I thought had done that best, I would say Spinoza. Spinoza's ethics are very persuasive, and they're not derived from anything that comes from divine revelation.
Wait, this is whose ethics? I'm sorry, whose ethics?
Spinoza. First known as Baruch, but then when expelled and excommunicated and condemned, ostracized by the synagogue in Amsterdam, and condemned by all the Christian churches in Europe as well, became Benedict Spinoza.
A pantheist by common description, right?
Yeah, well, yes, pantheism is the only way. He's not even a deist. I mean, he says that God is sort of everywhere and everything.
Right.
He repudiates the idea of a personal God. Then the second very intriguing question, what things can we say are true for all time? Now, what most people have hit upon is the golden rule, sometimes known as love thy neighbor, sometimes love thy neighbor as thyself, which I think is, by the way, impossible, and even immoral, because it demands something of you can't do, so you'll have to go on failing, so therefore you'll have to feel guilty. No one's going to love people like they love themselves and their own families, so it's guilt-inducing and coercive. Or sometimes stated, as it was by Rabbi Hillel and Confucius, long before any monotheism by Confucius in the Analects, don't do to another person what you wouldn't like done to yourself. Now, is that really true for all time and all people? I would actually say not. I mean, it's only as good as the person saying it, for one thing. I mean,
well, wait.
I don't want Charles Manson to be treated as I want to be treated. I don't. There are a lot of people I think should be treated worse than me, and I could give you persuasive reasons why I think that's so, but I couldn't say I'd found an absolute truth, and neither can any religious spokesman do that.
Of course, the way people get around that is they say that I would not ask myself to be treated, to be kept out of prison if I murdered people, and so they maintain an internal consistency while subscribing to the golden rule. But you're right, that's why subscribing to the golden rule by itself will get you nowhere, because people are very good at thinking up reasons to exclude people.
I would call that casuistry.
What's that?
I wouldn't call it consistency, I'd call it casuistry. And when you're talking to people like that, they already have all the information they need, so that every new thing that is discovered or thought, they say, oh, actually, that was always in the Bible all along. There's no nourishment in a discussion of that kind. It's the same as saying, those who are without sin, only those without sin can cast the first stone. It's a completely preposterous idea, as is the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Both these extreme positions on morality are taken in the Bible, and both of them are utterly useless to us. One is savage and boring, and the other is insipid and inapplicable. I'm saying wherever we're going to find moral rules that are more or less consistent across time and societies, and we are very lucky as a species in that there's almost no difference between us. I mean, the variation among humankind is so tiny as to be almost not measurable. If we were dogs, we'd all be the same breed. So there probably is a likelihood we could find some code on which everyone would be able to agree, but we haven't, I think, quite done that yet. And one reason for that is that religion stands in the way. I'm never going to subscribe to Muslim morality. And I don't think anybody should.
No, I think secular people have just as much trouble disagreeing on morality as religious people, I believe, in my own experience.
They don't invent difficulties where none exist. They don't say... You said earlier about Dr. King, how it shows how adaptable... When I said how good it is he didn't take Exodus literally, you said, well, religion is marvelously adaptable. What you mean is that there is a human standard to which religion eventually had better conform if it wants to be thought moral. For example, the Jewish prayer is supposed to begin every day for a man. Said, before we start, I just want to thank God for making me a man and not a woman, and for not making me a Gentile. Right now, how many Jews do you know who really believe that? I know some who are very orthodox who do. Most Jews say, no, that's terrible. You know, in order to be moral, I have to forget what God asks me to do. Yeah. You'll find that's true across every religion.
Right, but as you said, you don't know many Jews like that in the modern world, even though it's a scripture that was once taken very seriously, which points to the
word of God, man. I mean, you can take it religion.
Yeah, but you didn't need religion to make people tribalistic, okay? You can go to hunter-gatherer societies who don't justify their hostility toward neighboring peoples by reference to the will of any particular god. People are just very good at tribalism, and when they're religious, it's manifested that way. And but it doesn't have to be.
And men are not bad at wanting to keep women as available chattel either, if they're left to themselves. Right. But to sanctify it with a divine warrant, wouldn't you say, makes those things worse? Poisons them, in fact. To say this is not me. If someone says this, he says, "I'm proposing today. Tell you what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go and blow up an old people's home in Netanya on Passover. Why am I going to do this? It doesn't sound like a very recreational, moral way to spend your day. I'm doing it because God wants me to do it." I've mentioned this to you before. I mean, if a Greek American soldier blew himself up in his barracks or murdered his fellows, saying, you know, I can't stand the fact that the United States policy is so pro-Turkish in NATO, you would not think that that was a good enough reason, would you? But once it's been invested with the divine, everyone says, oh my God, we better take all this very seriously.
Yeah, but that's a good example.
That's the indulgence I want to withdraw from consideration of wickedness.
But you just gave us an example where the motivation is nationalistic and not religious, and I don't understand the argument you're making, if you are making it, that the fact of a religious justification makes a crime worse than it would otherwise be. To my mind, keeping women as chattel is as bad as it is. Whatever the justification is invalid, and I don't see how it being in a religious context makes it worse. Did I misunderstand you?
Well, only if you didn't didn't agree with my observation that if these things are given divine warrant, that they're thereby strengthened. If you don't think giving them a divine warrant strengthens them, then of course we have no quarrel. But I think that a lot of people were prevented from seeing what was wrong about slavery because they said it was mandated in the Bible, which it is. I think I personally would have to say that I doubt whether the Roman Catholic Church's description of Jews as collectively, indefinitely responsible for deicide had nothing to do with the massacre of the Jews of Europe. I have a feeling that the two things are connected. I can't absolutely prove it, but I wouldn't trust any disproof either.
Here we have, ironically, I may be a better Marxist than you, although you have a richer background in that belief system, where I just think that, you know, people create whatever ideological justification they need, ideology defined broadly to include religion, for what they are motivated to do by material, political, economic, self-interested, factors. And so there we just disagree, and there's probably no point belaboring that argument.
I certainly, German imperialism wanted to take the property of the Jewish people of Germany and dispossess them of it. There's no question about that, and of other countries too. But the power of the anti-Semitic ideology on which they were able to draw came from generations of religious miseducation and lying. About the Jews being an alien and evil people.
But isn't it worth noting that I'm sure you have to respond to this point all the time. No doubt you've got a great response, but isn't it notable that Hitler, and for that matter, the sponsors of pretty much all of the great atrocities of the 20th century, Stalin, Mao, and so on, seem not to have been theists?
Oh, to the contrary. I mean, Hitler's first political action was a concordat with the Vatican. Well,
he was a politician, of course. I mean, see, this is what I mean. You are so selective in when you decide to attribute cynicism to someone's use of religion, okay? In that case, the fact that he deployed religion for political purposes, because he was a bad guy, you say reflected real religiosity.
No, I didn't say that.
I'm not denying that religion can be used to bad ends.
It's ridiculous to say that he was secular or atheist. Otherwise, why would the German army belt buckle have said God on our side? Why would I'll take a trivial point.
Who were themselves religious,
I'll take a trivial point. Hitler's birthday was celebrated from the pulpits in Germany by order of the churches every year of his time.
Of course, but that doesn't reflect on his own true religiosity.
Don't call him secular then. I only know of one place in official Europe. Now, I think there probably is only one where you can still see a swastika on a display. It's in the huge basilica near the Escorial outside Madrid. That is one of the places where Franco is buried. It was built with slave labor from the Republican losers of the Civil War. There's a swastika on the ceiling when you look up to honor the German contribution to the victory of Catholic Spain over atheism. And there's also a German steel helmet in the mosaic. I'm sorry, you might not know this, but you irritate me and you potentially insult me by suggesting that my opinions are to be grouped with National Socialism. I won't have it, in other words.
Wait,
the guilt is on the other side.
Oh, you mean because I'm saying
secularism and atheism are not part of the hideous system of fascism, which, in my opinion, was mainly a product in Southern and Balkan Europe of the Catholic clerical right wing.
You take it as an affront to you personally and an indictment of you personally if I point to an atheist who has done something bad.
I'd say I don't like even the suggestion of it. I'm being as mild as I can.
And do you similarly exercise the restraint you're asking me to exercise by not suggesting in the presence of any religious person, including a very good one, that any other religious person has ever done anything bad? Are you similarly considerate of their feelings as you're asking me to be?
No, I'm not saying you mustn't hurt my feelings.
No,
I'm saying
you
ought to be aware that you're doing so. It looked to me as if you didn't realize that you were making. It looked to me as if you were, without knowing it, so I forgive you, making an insinuation.
So it's something that needs forgiving. Well, then when you do the comparable thing with religious people, does that need forgiving? Is that something that should be forgiven?
Well, the Catholic Church has tried and failed to apologize for its generations of anti-Semitism.
Christopher, don't change the subject.
No,
what I'm asking is this. I mean, this is really,
exactly where
this is such a typical debating point by you, okay?
I'm sorry. If there was nothing in what I said, the Vatican wouldn't have kept on trying to apologize for its years of anti-Semitic propaganda. I mean, it wasn't until 1964, nearly 30 years after the Nuremberg trials, 20 years after the Nuremberg trials, that they said that they no longer accused the Jewish people collectively of deicide.
Christopher.
I still don't think the apology is complete, but I can see the bad conscience that they must have about it. Now, you say that's just political opportunism. The alliance between Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, Salazar, all the other dictators and the church. I say it's not. I say it's the product of a long period of telling people who might not otherwise have got the idea, in every Mass, every Easter, that the Jewish people were their enemies. I think you can't do that and not expect bad behavior to be a consequence of it. And you just brushed it off and said, oh, well, people just make up ideologies to suit them. Actually, it wasn't very evolutionarily helpful for Jews to be driven out of Europe and murdered and their property taken. All societies that do that fall into ruin.
Christopher,
well, you said you were utilitarian.
Christopher, what point are you making? Who said it was?
Well, I'm saying your utilitarian point seems a bit thin in the face of that, doesn't it?
What?
Do utilitarians
believe, Christopher, can I talk? Do utilitarians believe that everything that happens is for the good? Is that what you think a utilitarian is?
No. The utilitarian principle is most famously encapsulated as the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
That is what is to be desired, not what always happens. No. And I'm saying it's no less likely to happen under religious auspices than under secular auspices. I mean, these periods of history you're talking about are periods back when virtually everyone was religious. Pretty much every good thing and bad thing that happened was done by a religious person. But I just have to return to this silly point you brought up, where because I pointed to an atheist who'd done something bad, you turned around and made it sound like it was some inexcusable affront to you personally. And then I said, well, wait a second. When you do a comparable thing to a religious person, in the presence of a religious person, complain about some crime perpetrated by a religious person, should they be equally offended? And you went off on some weird tangent. I just don't, that's just a silly distraction. I mean, do you really think you should reasonably be...
I think you'll find that the digression is your fault. I said that I thought that a long religious preachment, in this case of anti-Semitism by Christianity, had terrible consequences, had made good people behave badly in a very epoch-making way. And you appear to say in riposte that the main preacher of that evil, Adolf Hitler, was in some way of my way of thinking about religion. I had to say I thought that was A, wrong, and B, without becoming tearful about it, more insulting than you might want to be. I mean, if you should either say if you think that Nazism is a version of secularism, if you think so, or not, but don't try and just imply it. As for taking offense, look, man, I mean, every day I have to listen to religious people saying that the teachings of Darwin are false, that Jews should be killed, that homosexuals are wicked, that women... I mean, if I was insulted by this kind of thing, if I took offense, I'd have no time to do anything else. It's they who say they have the right to threaten me with death for offending them who are the problem. Don't try and put me on all fours with that either, please.
Well, I'm flattered that you feel a need to distract us from the actual issues.
I don't know. I think that was a digression, but I think you started it. But I think it was worth having.
Okay, so in the future, no one in a debate with you about whether religion is on balance a good thing or a bad thing, and by implication whether non-belief is more likely to be a good thing than a bad thing, will be allowed in your presence to point to anything an unbeliever has done that is bad. I can see how those debating rules would favor you, and I don't blame you for advocating them.
I will put myself in the safekeeping of the people who watch this item.
You will be in good hands,
and I'll ask them to write in if they say that you have summarized my opinion correctly.
You don't have to worry. I assure you that on this issue of religion, you have many more followers on this website than I have. I've done the empirical work.
It's not a matter of a vote.
The commenters will be overwhelmingly on your side, and if that's your primary goal in life, you have arrived.
No, I wouldn't say that it was. Anyway, I don't think that I should take any more time with this. I'll just put myself in the keeping of the audience and see if anyone thinks you summarized my opinion correctly.
Okay. So we can move on then?
Well, what choice do we have?
Okay, so let me give you one example. I take you to be saying that there's something inherently bad about the irrational influence of religion, and I would like to move the subject soon to the question of how should we confront, what strategically should we do about cases where undeniably religion has become intertwined with bad and does help motivate people to do bad, which I certainly don't deny. But first, I just want to clarify the meaning of your subtitle and your position on the intrinsic badness of the irrational influence of religion. I just want to give you a case where I think the irrational influence of religion was good, and let me know, A, if you agree, B, if you find that inconsistent with your thesis. I was raised a Southern Baptist, in El Paso, Texas, in the early 60s. This is around the time that the Civil Rights Act was being passed, and it was, Texas was certainly not the state where it was most popular. And there I was, a 7 or 8 year old or something, subject to the irrational influence of the Southern Baptist Church. And what was going on in that church was that every week in Sunday school we sang the song "Jesus Loves You," which includes the words Jesus loves the little children, which includes the words "red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in His sight." And I cannot imagine that did not reinforce in my mind the idea that black people are just as valuable morally as white people. It reinforced it in an irrational way. It wasn't like a logical argument. It was drawing on my irrational devotion at that time to God. It seems to me that was a positive effect of religion, and I think I could point to many others, not to mention all the people working in soup kitchens under religious inspiration and so on. But do you deny that's an example of the good use?
Not at all, any more than I would deny. I mean, some people appear to say that if it wasn't for their belief in God, they wouldn't be giving money, say, to charities in Africa. Okay. I mean, I find it an alarming admission. They say it's because I'm a Christian that I do it. They say, what, if you lost your faith, you'd stop caring about Africans? I never quite understand that. But let's say, I grant it happily, that some people make that their reason, and perhaps it gives them additional motivation. I'm quite content. I take them at their word. My challenge on this point is the following. I'm sure I've tried it on you before. If I haven't, I'll try it on you now. You have to name a moral action or an ethical statement made by someone of faith or because of their faith that couldn't be made by me as an unbeliever. You won't be able to find one. And if you're telling me that without that verse, you would have thought, well, when it says Jesus loves the children, in itself a meaningless statement, but surely that doesn't mean black children. If you're saying otherwise, you might have thought that. I leave it to you to say so, but I really doubt it. I mean, the corollary to my point, by the way, the corollary question, find a moral or ethical statement that an unbeliever couldn't make or perform, is think of a bad thing done or said by a believer because of their religion. Now you've immediately thought of one, and so has everyone who's watching this. But I love these games. And for example, the Reverend Bailey Smith, some big-mouth idiot who was Jerry Falwell's deputy, once made an anti-Semitic statement that I thought was factually true. Shall I tell you what it is?
Sure.
God doesn't hear the prayers of a Jew, he said. I couldn't agree more. I don't think God does hear the prayers of a Jew or anyone else. Right. So you can, if you're a religious person, make a ridiculous statement that is consistent with some of the rules of rationality. But it's more likely to be a coincidence, I'd say, than anything else.
So you asked me if I could name a moral belief held by a religious person that could not be held by a secular person.
Moral action taken or statement made, yes. And
can you name for me an immoral action taken by a secular person that could not be taken by a religious person?
No, I think I'd have to accept
like
that would be.
And my point is sustained.
We don't say that our morality is necessarily superior. We simply say that the reliance on the supernatural is superfluous at best, and can lead to wicked things. I've already instanced that you refused to take me up on it. Centuries of Christian preaching against the Jews, which I said in the end that was going to lead to evil, and you didn't take me up on it then, and you haven't since. You said, oh, well, that kind of thing could happen anywhere. I don't think so. It's a long inculcation of simple people with evil falsehoods in the name of a religion.
Now, religious doctrine does have some enduring effect. I'm not the most simplistic kind of, Marxist in that sense or materialist in that sense. I would just say that, back in those days, all good and bad things resulted from religion. Now, back when everyone was religion, all the good stuff and bad stuff was justified. When everyone was religious, all the good stuff and bad stuff was justified by religion. And yes, I do believe, by and large, most of the bad stuff was motivated fundamentally not by the religion, although justified in those terms. This is an almost metaphysical debate. I don't think there's any point in carrying it on a lot further.
I know I'd like to go on with it a little longer. By the way, since it's the second time you've mentioned Karl Marx, I think you may have noticed in my book, I quote what he actually did say about religion. Most people say that he denounced it just as an opiate. I quote what he says. It's from the introduction to his critique of Hegel's philosophy of Wright. He says, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, the spirit of a spiritless situation. And then he says it can be an opiate for the people. And he goes on to say, criticism of religion has plucked the flowers from the chain, and not in order that men and women may wear the chain without consolation, but so that they may break the chain and cull the living flower. Now, I perfectly understand why people have a need for the numinous, you might say, or the transcendent, the things that are part of our emotions that are not completely quantifiable to do with music, poetry, love, landscape, and so forth. There's no question that these are essential for us, almost as much as food and drink is. But there's no need to postulate anything supernatural about them. I think that, in fact, they're enjoyed better if they don't come as gifts from someone who wants something back from you.
Yeah, I don't deny. I don't disagree with you there. One final point on this: is religion good or bad? Where I would say essentially neither. It's about equally capable of both. But you, in your book, you recount this question. I guess Dennis Prager confronted you with, where he said, "Admit it. If you're walking down the street, it's dark. There's nobody else. You see a stranger approaching out of the shadows. Could be, would you rather be a religious person or not a religious person?"
Yes.
Right? And your reply was, as I recall, what country did you pick where if you were in
Well, I said,
Lebanon,
he said you had to imagine you're in a strange country, a strange town where you don't know anybody. This happens. It's evenings coming on, and you see a group of men coming towards you. Do you feel better or worse if you know they're coming from a prayer meeting? And I said, well, just without leaving the letter B, I've had that experience in Belfast, Beirut, Baghdad, Bombay. There's another B I'm not coming up with. Those four will do. And believe me, you don't want to be around when the church is let out in those places, or the mosques. You don't.
Oh, come on.
That's what I can't say that isn't what I said.
Well, what I was curious about was, honestly, if you did the thought experiment in the average American city, say you're in a part of town that could be a little dicey, all you know is whether that person is religious or not. Honestly, you would say in a part of town that's known to be dangerous and pervaded by crime, you would say, I would rather it be the not religious person in an American context?
Well, in a civilized, secular society with police force and enforceable laws and so on, I don't think it really makes very much difference. So I wouldn't want it to be the Nation of Islam's church, for example. No, but I mean, I think in a country that has managed to put religion under some kind of discipline and control, no, it doesn't apply. But look, there's a tautology involved in what both of us are saying, actually. When you say, well, people do bad things, but that's when everyone was religious, so everything, good or bad, was religious. And I say, well, I think religion has done some things that it would have taken a belief in God and supernatural permission to turn into wickedness. I still say that since religion is man-made, it is, if you like, also a secular product. But there's nothing more likely to intensify existing criminal, selfish, racist, enslaving, rapists, genital mutilation tendencies, suicidal and mass-murdering tendencies, than the belief that you have a divine permission to do this. Mm-hmm. And the fact that that is a man-made invention, because there obviously can't be a divine permission in my worldview, doesn't get you off the hook. I say it's religion that poisons everything.
Well, actually,
the belief that you have a special right because you say you have faith.
I think we've uncovered instances where you don't think it poisons everything. Like when I was singing that song in Sunday school, I don't think you thought I was the subject of a poisonous bad thing.
I would say, I've said, if you remember, I said it makes good people do bad things. And I added, and I hope you won't take this personally, that it makes intelligent people say dumb things. If you're telling me that on singing a ditty, it says that Jesus loves all the children, and this must mean black kids, that had a real effect on your mind, I'll have to take your word for it. But I mean, I can't believe that such a thing was necessary for you. And I think you do yourself no favor.
I was 8 years old. I guarantee you it did. It was the I would say benign use of the indoctrination of a child.
Well, then you're going to have to accept all the Christian churches that said there are no black people allowed into this church, and God separated the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
No. You see, again,
you have to accept them. If you're going to take credit for one, my dear, you have to accept the responsibility for the rest.
Christopher,
and I'm sorry, I actually don't really believe your story. I don't think that came as a revelation to you, because there's no such person as Jesus. He has no particular attitude towards children, except he thinks people should leave their families and follow him.
I would say,
by the way, denominating those children by color in the hymn is a bad idea to begin with. So, but why not just say he likes all the children, even though he didn't?
Christopher, when you say I have to accept the bad with religion with the good, I do, because remember, I'm not arguing that religion is more good than bad. you're the person with the burden of
I'm
showing.
not clear to see what it is you are
And this
arguing.
explains why you're straining in these cases.
Well, no.
You're the one with the burden of showing that religion always has bad effects.
My burden actually isn't that. My burden is that everybody knows what I think and also how, and I keep saying it again and then giving, I think, ever more beautiful and elegant illustrations of it. But it's very difficult to argue with someone whose position is not disclosed. You don't tell me whether you think religion makes people behave better or not. You don't. You have said you don't believe in the supernatural, but I'm not clear what you do think. You don't have to think anything, but it's very difficult to go around with you when I don't know what your views are.
Oh, I've tried to be as clear as I can. I think that in both my book Nonzero and my book The Evolution of God, I've argued that there is a moral direction to history along at least one dimension. And I won't get into it even to bother explain what the dimension is. B, I think that it has some of the hallmarks of purpose in a way that doesn't necessarily imply the existence of a conscious designer, intelligent being, God. Could be that there's a God who set it all in motion in a kind of deistic way, but my view of history itself is materialistic and doesn't appeal to intervention or anything. In any event, I believe that there is a moral direction to history that helps me orient my life, and in that way provides some of the sustenance that religion provides for people. So maybe I'm religious even though I'm agnostic on the question of whether there's some being behind it all. That, in a nutshell, that's my position.
But it could or could not be the case. Well, I mean, I don't quarrel with that, but it's hard to argue with. I think, by the way, if you care, of course I've looked at your book about the evolution of God, and I should tell you, I mean, I've had I say it in my book as well. I mean, the hardest thing for me to give up when I stopped thinking like a socialist, not entirely stopped thinking like a Marxist, but when I found I couldn't make it match observable reality anymore. The hardest thing to give up is teleology, is the idea that the future can be better or will be, or simply in some way ought to be, that we are on, that our own evolution is an upward curve rather than just a blip. It's very, very difficult for a human being to give that up, but if you think what you just say you thought,
I have not given it up.
The collapse of European civilization into barbarism in the 20th century and the enormous role played by religious superstition in that collapse, the Counter-Reformation, the number of times that civilization was on the march in Europe and was retarded terribly by faith, by the Inquisition, by the Crusades. It makes it to be absolutely impossible for you to say that religion has been anything more than slightly modified in its barbarism by the achievements of science and by the exercise of ordinary humanistic morality. Well,
first of all, although my belief is that religion does about as much good as bad, my argument about teleology doesn't presuppose that at all. They're unrelated. And so I don't want to bore you with it, but it's just not relevant.
You mean the evolution part has nothing to do with your belief in the innate goodness or badness? That seems to be a hard separation to impose upon yourself, but that would be your choice.
I didn't hear you say.
Anyway, how is it to be quantified? I mean, for example, if I say what I'm sure of, which is that millions and millions of children's lives have been stunted and poisoned, to coin a phrase, by being told they're going to go to hell if they play with themselves or if they become Protestants or, as the case might be, Catholics. I mean, but there's no way of quantifying how much harm, how much misery that's done, is there? I mean, we can sometimes do body counts of things like the 30 Years' War and so forth, but it's very, very crude. We don't have a means of quantifying the evil that a religion has done.
It's very hard to quantify the good. Now, in your book, you generally ignore the good and only focus on the evil, so it's extremely hard to do it in that circumstance. But, you know, I waited too long to get to a subject I think we should at least glancingly touch on, because it's my motivation, really, for challenging your claim that religion is I think, an overwhelmingly universally bad thing, or however you would put it, which is that I think it leads you to a very counterproductive view on foreign policy. It leads you to think that the enemy of good is religion per se, that the source of conflict and terror is so often religion per se, as opposed to underlying circumstances that I think give rise to it. An example I often use is Israel-Palestine, where I think you would agree with me that as an historical matter, the tension there, the conflict there, began in a pretty secular context, right? I mean, the subsequent religious radicalization on both sides is indeed subsequent. And what seems to be the prime mover here is an argument over land.
No, I mean, actually, I'd like to share the premise with you, but I can't, because the claim in the first place, but admittedly it was a fairly secular Zionist movement that Herzl founded, but the claim that they were returning to the land is a claim to land that is supposedly awarded to them by God, who neither you nor I believe is involved in real estate. The opposition to it would have certainly been there if all the Palestinians were atheists. They wouldn't have wanted a Jewish colonization or any other kind.
Right.
But as it happens, it's made impossible to solve by the opposite claim that, yes, God does give land. Of course, we agree with Zionists and the rabbis about this. It's just that it's Muslim land. It's part of the lost Ottoman Muslim Caliphate. And of course, no Jews or unbelievers are allowed there. So what could have been, if it was a territorial dispute, solved with a two-state solution that the majority of people want a long time ago, is made completely insoluble precisely by not the deists, but the theists, the people who don't just believe in God, they believe God takes their side.
But you got to remember, I mean, you say that the original Zionists appealed to the Bible. That's true, but they were essentially secular. They appealed to it as an historical document.
Which it isn't. That's the last thing.
Well, no, of course it's not. But the point is, they didn't. Their argument was not, by and large, this proves that God wants us to be here. It was, damn it, we were here first. The kind of argument that secular people can have. And in fact, a very conscious decision was made in the founding documents of Israel to make no appeal, if you read the Hebrew as opposed to some of the translations, to make no appeal to divine sanction.
Excuse me, Robert, the Bible does not say they were there first. They had to clear out everyone else who lived there, the Canaanites.
Well, they were there before the Arabs.
Well,
there are no Canaanites in the fight today, okay?
Earlier doesn't give you any special right.
Well, that's the way it was deployed. These were not people who were invoking divine sanction.
Whether you know it or not, you're still making my point. Everything they do, they justify either by the Bible as either the Word of God or a historical document, and you and I both know it's neither.
As an historical document.
What?
Yeah. They were appealing to it as an historical document.
Yes, but it isn't a historical document any more than it's the Word of God, unless you disagree. And you don't think that's exacerbated the situation?
No, I think it was false history, but my point is their motivation was not religion. They, again, as people do, they found whatever convenient was convenient in the way of text or justification.
So the Jewish settlers who moved to the West Bank and steal other people's land are doing it because they think they have a historical claim. Is that what you're really saying?
Wait, I didn't hear that, I'm sorry.
The Jewish settlers who moved to the West Bank steal other people's land and build colonies on it that are now amount to the size of suburbs, are doing it because they say they have a properly legalized historical claim. You know very well that's not what they say.
No, I didn't say that. I said it, indeed, as the conflict festered, it became less nationalist and more religious. But the idea that the religion is the underlying cause is a mistake. The religious belief is now a big problem. I don't deny that.
Amazing that it should come from nowhere.
What?
Amazing that it should come from nowhere. Suddenly they're all religious in Jerusalem? I mean, you said it. I mean, I just have to... I don't feel I have to comment on that.
They're not all religious in Jerusalem, but you're right that that the more problematic settlers are.
Yes. Well, if you think the quarrel over the Holy Land is secular, I'm perfectly... in one way, I'm willing to agree with you, because after all human conflicts are secular. There is no God who takes sides. People who think that he does, or she does, or it does, are indeed dreaming. All conflicts are non-religious, if you want. I'll happily say that. The statement, there is no God, is as meaningless as the statement that there is one, because the entity under discussion is meaningless. But I said religion, not God. Okay? Now, religion which is at the root of the original quarrel, has also made it insoluble, is making it insoluble. These people, if you look at their propaganda, Jewish and Muslim, what they want is for the world to come to an end. They see in this the sign that they can bring on the Messiah.
The way this emphasis on the intrinsically, I would say almost autonomously bad role of religion is used by your compatriot Sam Harris, and you may or may not agree with him, is to say, as he has said explicitly, do not bother looking for material circumstances that motivate, that underlie violent Palestinian resistance or terrorism, because it's just religion. Now, obviously, the implication of that is, don't bother stopping the settlements. Don't bother even messing with things on the ground. And this is what most bothers me, and maybe you don't share Sam's view here, but this is what most bothers me about such an exclusive, and I would say misleadingly exclusive, emphasis on religion as the source of all evil.
Well, I don't know if that's what he says about Palestine or about the roots of Islamist violence in general, but I'm sure he wouldn't say the settlements had nothing to do with it. He certainly wouldn't do what not even you were willing to say and say the settlements are not to do with religion. On the broader question, I don't think it's true, for example, that bin Ladenism, whatever you want to call it, jihadism, is created by poverty and unemployment. No, I know it's the cause of a lot of poverty and unemployment. In fact, it's the deliberate cause of a lot of poverty and unemployment, because that's the ground in which they hope to operate. I mean, the blowings up of the hotels in Indonesia, for example, greatly reduced the national income of an already very poor country. It isn't the product of unemployment and poverty, it's the cause of it. You'll find that's consistent across the board. Afghanistan was reduced to beggary by the Taliban. So there's an always wonderfully congruent coexistence between extreme religiosity, poverty, disease, ignorance, illiteracy, and superstition. But that's the stew we're actually dealing with. However, I think people who say, I'm going to kill you, that's my friend Fleming Rose, for example, who's the editor of a newspaper in Denmark, an Al-Qaeda cell in Chicago, Illinois, has been found to have been helping to plot the death of an editor of a newspaper in the Democratic Open Society of Denmark. Are you telling me they're doing that because they feel that their wage packet has shrunk? Come on.
No, my own emphasis is really not on poverty, but it is on various material circumstances, and I'll link to the piece in which I quote Sam Harris saying, I think, don't bother to look for this, or any other such variable. We'll link, and if I'm wrong, we'll see that I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure he holds that if you don't find, then I would consider you more enlightened.
Well, I mean, I'm a very great admirer of Dr. Harris, and I'll give you an example of, without consulting him or having read his stuff, the government of Gaza is currently run by Hamas, a ruthlessly Islamist party which publishes the protocols of the Elders of Zion, an anti-Jewish fabrication, on its website, and calls for the destruction of all Jewish people and for the total Islamization of Palestine. Now, these people have been told if they'll drop saying these things, the embargo imposed on them by the United Nations and others in the European Union will be lifted. They'll be able to get building permits. They'll be able to have all kinds of construction and aid. The floodgates of help will open for the people of Gaza. But they won't do that. That's not a price. They'll keep people in Gaza in poverty and misery and fear because they will not give up their religious fanaticism.
Well, you know what that's an example of to me? It's the way governing elites in general often sacrifice the welfare of their people. I would make a comparable argument about the relatively secular leadership in the West Bank of the Palestinian people. There are things they could be doing, but it would threaten the supply of money to them, and they're not justifying it in terms of religion, but it's still happening because elites are elites, and they're often bad. But, you know, as long as we're on the subject of Sam Harris, the one final, we're running over time, but finally, I said this to kind of you and Sam in Mexico when we had this debate in Puebla, which I guess we can link to. I mean, it was such a multi-party debate that people should not go there for the thrill of mano-a-mano combat. But
no, indeed.
But I said to Sam, I think I don't think I'm caricaturing your view when I mean Sam's view especially, but I think yours is. What we have to do, the priority has to be, expunge religion from the planet. And I said, so I think, Sam, your view is that if we will only, if we will run up to these Muslim extremists who are terrorists or who may be amenable to that or may be leaning in that direction, grab them, shake them, and say, don't you understand, your God doesn't exist. I think Sam's view seems to be that's a productive thing to do. I beg to differ. And it's, again, because I think religion is not intrinsically bad, and many of these people who have not yet made the leap to terrorism will not necessarily make it, but they're more likely to make it. Like all religious people of all persuasions, they are more likely to be fundamentalist if they feel threatened. So leaving aside the merits of the case, I don't think it's tactically a productive strategy.
Well, I don't know of any instance of Dr. Harris going to the region and telling Muslims they must give up their religion, which is all nonsense anyway. He's been pursuing his career in neuroscience and building up a wonderful website called Reason, on which you can access almost all the debates and texts about the debates and debates about the texts of religion since human history began. So what you say isn't even a caricature. What I say in my book, since it's me talking, perhaps I can just discuss that. I say, if religion will leave me alone, I'm fine. I don't even want to have to know what someone else believes, as long as they keep it at home or within their family. But I know so many people now who live in the United States and Western Europe who have to go around under armed guard for things they've published that are novels, for example, or cartoons or editorials. Because Islam says, no, we will follow you home and we'll kill you because we think you've been rude to us. Now, if you don't see that that's a challenge, and obviously I can see from everything you've said before that you don't think so, then I think it's time to put up.
That's not true.
No, you have invariably in all our discussions, you said, to the extent that it's true, it's because people like me must have upset them. And I'm sorry, I don't make just the assertion. I simply say to anyone watching this, replay and see. You've never attributed the cause of any of this to itself, to its text, to its faith, to the preachments of the imams. It's invariably the outcome of some grievance that is inflicted upon them. No. This is a very, very, very dangerous parody of the real situation.
No, the preachments of imams do matter, and it gets back to a point that came up in our previous discussion where in your critique of my op-ed piece about Major Hassan, I said his perception of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq had seemed to push him toward or onto a slippery slope toward terrorism, whatever. I said, you said no, he was pulled by this imam, this radical imam. I agree, he was pulled, and my point is American foreign policy should not give the imam the rhetorical tools to effectively pull people. So I'm not denying the role of religious preachment, of religious scripture. I'm saying, there's a lot of unfortunate stuff out in the world, including some in those categories. But I'm saying, to work with them intelligently, you cannot start with premises such as those that is the subtitle of your book, that religion poisons everything. It manifestly does not. We do not have to eradicate religion in order to save the world.
The homicidal ravings of al-Awlaki, the Imam of Major Hassan, are not the outcome of the attempt of secular democracy to defend itself.
No, not many things aren't.
They are
many
not.
Bad things aren't.
They are their own responsibility, and the responsibility for it is his. Mm-hmm. And one day, I hope we'll catch up with him.
Okay. Finally, before I graciously...
You'll then be able to say when he goes on trial, poor guy, he was driven to it by, who will it be? The editor of the Copenhagen paper, by Salman Rushdie, by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, they all just made his head buzz like a hive and forced him to tell people to shoot their medical colleagues, having taken a Hippocratic oath. Do you understand why I'm sounding like this? I'd find it hateful to think that you really did believe anything of what you just said.
As I said in the previous dialogue, when I point to something that may indeed have encouraged someone to do something bad, like the Iraq War encouraging this Major Hassan to kill people, I do not mean to in the least alleviate them from moral responsibility or assign blame in a moral sense to America. I'm trying to illuminate the costs and benefits of policy. I'm trying to illuminate the costs and benefits of policy. And as I said last time, until we get better in defiance of right-wing propagandists at separating the question of blame from the question of impartial causal analysis about costs and benefits of alternative policies, we will be screwed. And I'm not sure I have your support in that campaign. Before I graciously give you the last word, I just want to say one thing. I was very relieved to hear you say earlier that your feeling is kind of live and let live. What people want to believe in the privacy of their own churches, as long as they don't do any harm, is their business. I'm relieved to hear you say that. I'm a little surprised because I've got to say the tone that comes out of your writing is the following. You know, my view is that life is hard. I really find it hard, and I think anyone who takes a stab at living a moral life is going to find it hard. I believe everyone who does that winds up doing it on the basis of something they can't prove, something probably that is in some sense irrational, and often something that is in some sense a crutch. What I hear you saying, and maybe you've now corrected me and I won't think you're saying that anymore, but what comes through in the tone of your writing is, well, I'm sorry, but all of you are coping with this difficult challenge of life in a way that's just intellectually laughable. And if only you were as smart as I am, you wouldn't be resorting to this. And that seems to me not really a lit and let live policy. That seems to be a live and ridicule policy. And it really bothers me, the elitism and air of superiority in your writing.
Well, I'll come at that in reverse order, if I may. The religion makes very large claims for itself. In some cases it claims to be infallible or to have spokesmen who are. It also says, if you agree with us, we can offer you salvation. If you don't, we can promise you damnation. These are very big claims that they then want to say, by the way, you're not allowed to criticize or ridicule this either. I must say, I think that's asking a bit much, don't you? Now then, if their fallback position is, well, it makes people behave better, well, I think we've already discussed that. I say there's no proof that people wouldn't have behaved that well anyway, and there are many crimes specifically attributable to superstitious and supernatural belief. And then on the point of coexistence, which I do say in my book, it's because they won't accept the offer. I mean, I do have to hear from a madrasa in Virginia, a very short way, distance from where I'm sitting now, preachments from a man who now chooses to live in Yemen for his own safety, having encouraged the 9/11 hijackers and Major Hassan. I am forced to listen to that. In Washington, just to stay where we are, the Catholic Church has just said, if the city passes an ordinance about gay rights, it wants to withdraw from its charitable donations to the city. It won't be involved if it has to recognize this kind of thing. Makes it very clear, by the way, that their effort is a proselytizing one, not just a charitable one. American tax dollars are spent all the time on aid to Israel, some part of which is used for the building of the establishment of a religion on the West Bank by messianic thieves who hope to bring on the Messiah. And I can hardly open the newspaper without seeing another attempt to have government money spent on the teaching of pseudoscience in our schools. Now, if you want to coexist with me, have your religious beliefs, I don't care. I will continue to find them ridiculous and I'll continue to satirize, and I hope you can take it. If your God isn't strong enough to insulate you against my jokes, too bad, tough. But don't try and have your beliefs taught to my children. Don't ask for my tax dollars to support your church. Don't ask for my money to be spent on colonial settlements. And don't preach jihad in my neighborhood. Or threaten to send people from Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere to kill friends of mine in London for the crime of writing a novel. Have I begun to make myself play? They won't leave me alone, so I am a member of a group that you scorn and insult. And
I don't scorn atheists. I do not scorn.
No, you've written nothing but scornful. You've written scornful and insulting things about a group you call the New Atheists, as if we were the fundamentalists.
True.
I've decided to become a member of a force of people. It doesn't need every time, 5 times a day to pray. Doesn't need constant reinforcement. Doesn't need to sing hymns saying what Jesus wants or any nonsense of this kind. Just coolly decides there must be a pushback to theocracy and its propagandists and its actions. And it's long overdue, a defense of science and reason and humanism. And to that proposition, I am, without sounding too sententious about it, willing to give the rest of my life. And you might ask me, why would I do that since I think I'm only a primate? And I say, well, some questions are undecidable. But in the meantime, I'm not willing to be told what to do by people who say that God gives them a right to push me around. I won't spend a minute of my life
I agree.
that way.
I agree that you should not. And in keeping with my vow to let you have the last word, I will.
Oh, I think that was it, wasn't it?
What's that? Those words were the last, I think.
Well,
yeah.
I thought you said we were already over time.
We are over time. That's why I decided that those should be your last words.
Oh, well, good. I thought you said I could have some more. That would be...
No.
That would be greedy.
If you want more, I have made a vow of silence, obviously, in asserting that you would have the last word, so I can't say more. If you want to say more, go ahead.
No, really. I think you've been more than generous.
Okay, well, you have more than I have, because I know your services are very much in demand, yet you agreed to do this for free, a double-header taping, 2 consecutive hours of enduring me. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure, and in some ways an illumination. And if you find anybody who will pay us to do this, let me know, okay?
You bet.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye.